I cannot get used to this world, to procreation, to heredity, to sight, to hearing. The commonest things are a burthen. The prim, obliterated, polite surface of life, and the broad, body, and orgiastic, or monadic, foundations, form a spectacle to which no habit reconciles me. R. L. Stevenson, Letters. 2, 355. Cautionary Verses for Children, this title of a much-used work, published early in the 19th century, shows how far the muse of evangelical Protestantism in England, with her mind fixed on the idea of danger, had at last drifted away from the original gospel. Freedom. Mind cure might be briefly called a reaction against all that religion of chronic anxiety which marked the earlier part of our century in the evangelical circles of England and America. I refer to Mr. Horatio W. Dresser and Mr. Henry Wood, especially the former. Mr. Dresser's works are published by G. P. Putnam's Sons, New York and London. Mr. Wood's by Lee and Shepherd, Boston. Lest my own testimony be suspected, I will quote another reporter, Dr. H. H. Goddard, of Clark University, whose thesis on the effects of mind on body as evidenced by faith cures is published in the American Journal of Psychology for 1899, Volume 10. This critic, after a wide study of the facts, concludes that the cures by mind cure exist, but are in no respect different from those now officially recognized in medicine as cures by suggestion. And the end of his essay contains an interesting physiological speculation as to the way in which the suggestive ideas may work, page 67 of the reprint. As regards the general phenomenon of mental cure itself, Dr. Goddard writes, in spite of the severe criticism we have made of reports of cure, there still remains a vast amount of material, showing a powerful influence of the mind in disease. Many cases are of diseases that have been diagnosed and treated by the best physicians of the country, or which prominent hospitals have tried their hand at curing, but without success. People of culture and education have been treated by this method with satisfactory results. Diseases of long standing have been ameliorated, and even cured. We have traced the mental element through primitive medicine and folk medicine of today, patent medicine, and witchcraft. We are convinced that it is impossible to account for the existence of these practices, if they did not cure disease, and that if they cured disease, it must have been the mental element that was effective. The same argument applies to those modern schools of mental therapeutics, divine healing and Christian Science. It is hardly conceivable that the large body of intelligent people who comprise the body known distinctively as mental scientists should continue to exist if the whole thing were a delusion. It is not a thing of a day. It is not confined to a few, it is not local. It is true that many failures are recorded, but that only adds to the argument. There must be many and striking successes to counterbalance the failures, otherwise the failures would have ended the delusion. Christian Science, divine healing, or mental science do not, and never can in the very nature of things, cure all diseases. Nevertheless, the practical applications of the general principles of the broadest mental science will tend to prevent disease. We do find sufficient evidence to convince us that the proper reform in mental attitude would relieve many a sufferer of ills that the ordinary physician cannot touch, would even delay the approach of death to many a victim beyond the power of absolute cure, and the faithful adherence to a truer philosophy of life will keep many a man well, And give the doctor time to devote to alleviating ills that are unpreventable, pp. 33, 34 of reprint. Horace Fletcher, Happiness. As found in Forethought-Fear Thought, Mentaculture. Series, 2. Chicago and New York, Stone, 1897, pages 21-25. Abridged. H. W. Dresser, Voices of Freedom, New York, 1899, page 38. Henry Wood, Ideal. Suggestion Through Mental Photography, Boston, 1899, page 54. Whether it differs so much from Christ's own notion is for the exegetists to decide. According to Harnack, Jesus felt about evil and disease much as our mind curers do. What is the answer which Jesus sends to John the Baptist? Asks Harnack, and says it is this. The blind see, and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead rise up, and the gospel is preached to the poor. That is the coming of the kingdom, or rather in these saving works the kingdom is already there. By the overcoming and removal of misery, of need, of sickness, by these actual effects John is to see that the new time has arrived. The casting out of devils is only a part of this work of redemption. But Jesus points to that as the sense and seal of his mission. Thus to the wretched, sick, and poor did he address himself, but not as a moralist, and without a trace of sentimentalism. He never makes groups and departments of the ills. He never spends time in asking whether the sick one deserves to be cured, and it never occurs to him to sympathize with the pain or the death. He nowhere says that sickness is a beneficent infliction, and that evil has a healthy use. No, he calls sickness sickness and health health. All evil, all wretchedness, is for him something dreadful, it is of the great kingdom of Satan, but he feels the power of the Savior within him. He knows that advance is possible only when weakness is overcome. When sickness is made well. Das Wesen des Chrysanthems. 1900, page 39. R. W. Trine, In Tune with the Infinite, 26,000, N. Y. 1899. I have strung scattered passages together. The Cairds, for example. In Edward Caird's Glasgow lectures of 1890-92 passages like this abound. The declaration made in the beginning of the ministry of Jesus that the time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of heaven is at hand, passes with scarce a break into the announcement that the kingdom of God is among you. And the importance of this announcement is asserted to be such that it makes, so to speak, a difference in kind between the greatest saints and prophets who lived under the previous reign of division, and the least in the kingdom of heaven. The highest ideal is brought close to men and declared to be within their reach, they are called on to be perfect as their Father in heaven is perfect. The sense of alienation and distance from God which had grown upon the pious in Israel just in proportion as they had learned to look upon him as no mere national divinity, but as a God of justice who would punish Israel for its sin as certainly as Edom or Moab, is declared to be no longer in place. And the typical form of Christian prayer points to the abolition of the contrast between this world and the next which through all the history of the Jews had continually been growing wider, as in heaven, so on earth. The sense of the division of man from God, as a finite being from the infinite, as weak and sinful from the omnipotent goodness, is not indeed lost, but it can no longer overpower the consciousness of oneness. The terms Son and Father at once state the opposition and mark its limit. They show that it is not an absolute opposition, but one which presupposes an indestructible principle of unity, that can and must become a principle of reconciliation. The Evolution of Religion, 2. Pages 146, 147. It remains to be seen whether the school of Mr. Dresser, which assumes more and more the form of Mind-cure experience and academic philosophy mutually impregnating each other, will score the practical triumphs of the less critical and rational sects. The theistic explanation is by divine grace, which creates a new nature within one the moment the old nature is sincerely given up. The pantheistic explanation, which is that of most mind-curers, is by the merging of the narrower private self into the wider or greater self, the spirit of the universe, which is your own subconscious self. The moment the isolating barriers of mistrust and anxiety are removed, the medico-materialistic explanation is that simpler. Cerebral processes act more freely where they are left to act automatically by the shunting out of physiologically, though in this instance not spiritually, higher ones which, seeking to regulate, only succeed in inhibiting results. Whether this third explanation might, in a psychophysical account of the universe, be combined with either of the others may be left an open question here. Within the churches a disposition has always prevailed to regard sickness as a visitation, something sent by God for our good, either as chastisement, as warning, or as opportunity for exercising virtue, and, in the Catholic Church, of earning merit. Illness, says a good Catholic writer, P. Lejeune, Introd. à la vie mystique, 1899, p. 218, is the most excellent of corporeal mortifications, the mortification which one has not one's self chosen, which is imposed directly by God, and is the direct expression of his will. If other mortifications are of silver, Manager Gay says, this one is of gold, since although it comes of ourselves, coming as it does of original sin, still on its greater side, as coming, like all that happens, from the providence of God, it is of divine manufacture. And how just are its blows! And how efficacious it is! I do not hesitate to say that patience in a long illness is mortification's very masterpiece, and consequently the triumph of mortified souls. According to this view, disease should in any case be submissively accepted, and it might under certain circumstances even be blasphemous to wish it away. Of course there have been exceptions to this, and cures by special miracle have at all times been recognized within the Church's pale, almost all the great saints having more or less performed them. It was one of the heresies of Edward Irving, to maintain them still to be possible. An extremely pure faculty of healing after confession and conversion on the patient's part, and prayer on the priest's, was quite spontaneously developed in the German pastor, Jo. Christoph Blumhardt, in the early 40s and exerted during nearly 30 years. Blumhardt's Life by Zundel, 5th edition, Zurich, 1887, gives in chapters 9, x, 11, and 17. A pretty full account of his healing activity, which he invariably ascribed to direct divine interposition. Blumhardt was a singularly pure, simple, and non-fanatical character, and in this part of his work followed no previous model. In Chicago today we have the case of Dr. J. A. Dowie, a Scottish Baptist preacher, whose weekly Leaves of Healing were in the year of grace 1900 in their 6th volume, and who, although he denounces the cures wrought in other sects as diabolical counterfeits of his own exclusively divine healing, must on the whole be counted into the mind-cure movement. In mind-cure circles the fundamental article of faith is that disease should never be accepted. It is wholly of the pit. God wants us to be absolutely healthy, and we should not tolerate ourselves on any lower terms. Edwards, from whose book On the Revival in New England I quote these words, dissuades from such a use of prayer, but it is easy to see that he enjoys making his thrust at the cold dead church members. H. W. Dresser, Voices of Freedom, 46. Dresser, Living by the Spirit, 58. Dresser, Voices of Freedom, 33. Trine, In Tune with the Infinite, page 214. Trine, page 117. Quoted by Lejeune, Introd. à la vie Mystique, 1899, page 66. Henry Wood, Ideal. Suggestion through Mental Photography, pages 51, 70, abridged. See appendix to this lecture for 2. Other cases furnished me by friends. Whether the various spheres or systems are ever to fuse integrally into one absolute conception, as most philosophers assume that they must, and how, if so, that conception may best be reached, are questions that only the future can answer. What is certain now is the fact of lines of disparate conception, each corresponding to some part of the world's truth, each verified in some degree, each leaving out some part of real experience. Tract on God, Man, and Happiness, Book 2, ch. X. Commentary on Galatians, Philadelphia. 1891, pages 510 to 514, abridged. Molinos, Spiritual Guide. Book 2, chaps. 17, 18. Abridged. I say this in spite of the monistic utterances of many mind-cure writers. For these utterances are really inconsistent with their attitude towards disease, and can easily be shown not to be logically involved in the experiences of union with a higher presence with which they connect themselves. The higher presence, namely, need not be the absolute whole of things. It is quite sufficient for the life of religious experience to regard it as a part, if only it be the most ideal part. C.F.J. Mill Sand, Luther E.T. Le Surfarbiter, 1884. Passim. He adds with characteristic healthy-mindedness, our business is to continue to fail in good spirits. The God of many men is little more than their court of appeal against the damnatory judgment passed on their failures by the opinion of this world. To our own consciousness there is usually a residuum of worth left over after our sins and errors have been told off. Our capacity of acknowledging and regretting them is the germ of a better self. In posse at least. But the world deals with us in actu and not in posse, and of this hidden germ, not to be guessed at from without, it never takes account. Then we turn to the All-Knower, who knows our bad, but knows this good in us also, and who is just. We cast ourselves with our repentance on his mercy. Only by an all-knower can we finally be judged. So the need of a God very definitely emerges from this sort of experience of life. E.g., Iliad, 17. For 46, nothing then is more wretched anywhere than man of all that breathes and creeps upon this earth. E.g., Theognis, 425 to 428. Best of all for all things upon earth is it not to be born nor to behold the splendors of the sun. Next best to traverse as soon as possible the gates of Hades. See also the almost identical passage in Oedipus in Colonus, 1225. The anthology is full of pessimistic utterances. Naked came I upon the earth, naked I go below the ground, why then do I vainly toil when I see the end naked before me? How did I come to be? Whence am I? Wherefore did I come? To pass away. How can I learn naught when naught I know? Being naught I came to life, once more shall I be what I was. Nothing and nothingness is the whole race of mortals. For death we are all cherished and fattened like a herd of hogs that is wantonly butchered. The difference between Greek pessimism and the Oriental and modern variety is that the Greeks had not made the discovery that the pathetic mood may be idealized, and figure as a higher form of sensibility. Their spirit was still too essentially masculine for pessimism to be elaborated or lengthily dwelt on in their classic literature. They would have despised a life set wholly in a minor key, and summoned it to keep within the proper bounds of lachrymosity. The discovery that the enduring emphasis, so far as this world goes, may be laid on its pain and failure, was reserved for races more complex, and, so to speak, more feminine than the Hellenes had attained to being in the classic period. But all the same was the outlook of those Hellenes blackly pessimistic. For instance, on the very day on which I write this page, the post brings me some aphorisms from a worldly-wise old friend in Heidelberg which may serve as a good contemporaneous expression of Epicureanism, by the word happiness. Every human being understands something different. It is a phantom, pursued only by weaker minds. The wise man is satisfied with the more modest but much more definite term contentment. What education should chiefly aim at is to save us from a discontented life. Health is one favoring condition, but by no means an indispensable one, of contentment. Woman's heart and love are a shrewd device of nature. A trap which she sets for the average man, to force him into working. But the wise man will always prefer work chosen by himself. Ribot, Psychologie des Sentiments, page 54. A. Grétry, Souvenirs de ma jeunesse, 1880, pages 119 to 121, abridged. Some persons are affected with anhedonia permanently, or at any rate with a loss of the usual appetite for life. The annals of suicide supply such examples as the following. An uneducated domestic servant, aged 19, poisons herself, and leaves 2 letters expressing her motive for the act. To her parents she writes, "Life is sweet perhaps to some, but I prefer what is sweeter than life, and that is death. So goodbye forever, my dear parents. It is nobody's fault, but a strong desire of my own which I have longed to fulfill for 3 or 4 years. I have always had a hope that some day I might have an opportunity of fulfilling it, and now it has come. It is a wonder I have put this off so long, but I thought perhaps I should cheer up a bit and put all thought out of my head." To her brother she writes, "Goodbye forever, my own dearest brother. By the time you get this I shall be gone forever. I know, dear love, there is no forgiveness for what I am going to do. I am tired of living, so am willing to die. Life may be sweet to some, but death to me is sweeter." S. A. K. Strahan, Suicide and Insanity, 2d edition, London, 1894, page 131. Rubinovich E. T. Toulouse. La Mélancolie, 1897, page 170, abridged. I cull these examples from the work of G. Dumas, La Tristesse et la Joie, 1900. My extracts are from the French. Translation by Zania. In abridging I have taken the liberty of transposing one passage. Grace abounding to the chief of sinners, I have printed a number of detached passages. Continuously. The Life and Journal of the Reverend Mr. Henry Alline, Boston, 1806, pages 25, 26. I owe my acquaintance with this book to my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Rand. Compare Bunyan, there was I struck into a very great trembling. Insomuch that at some times I could, for days together, feel my very body, as well as my mind, to shake and totter under the sense of the dreadful judgment of God, that should fall on those that have sinned that most fearful and unpardonable sin. I felt also such clogging and heat at my stomach, by reason of this my terror, that I was, especially at some times, as if my breastbone would have split asunder. Thus did I wind, and twine, and shrink under the burden that was upon me, which burden also did so oppress me that I could neither stand, nor go, nor lie either at rest or quiet. For another case of fear equally sudden, see Henry James, Society the Redeemed Form of Man, Boston, 1879, pages 43 ff. Example, it was about 11 o'clock at night, but I strolled on still with the people. Suddenly upon the left side of our road, a crackling was heard among the bushes. All of us were alarmed, and in an Instant a tiger, rushing out of the jungle, pounced upon the one of the party that was foremost, and carried him off in the twinkling of an eye. The rush of the animal, and the crush of the poor victim's bones in his mouth, and his last cry of distress. Ho hi, involuntarily re-echoed by all of us, was over in 3 seconds. And then I know not what happened till I returned to my senses, when I found myself and companions lying down on the ground as if prepared to be devoured by our enemy, the sovereign of the forest. I find my pen incapable of describing the terror of that dreadful moment. Our limbs stiffened, our power of speech ceased, and our hearts beat violently, and only a whisper of the same, ho hi, was heard from us. In this state we crept on all fours for some distance back, and then ran for life with the speed of an Arab horse for about half an hour, and fortunately happened to come to a small village. After this, every one of us was attacked with fever, attended with shivering, in which deplorable state we remained till morning. Autobiography of Lutfullah, a Mohammedan gentleman, Leipzig, 1857, page 112. E.g. Our young people are diseased with the theological problems of original sin, origin of evil, predestination, and the like. These never presented a practical difficulty to any man, never darkened a cross any man's road, who did not go out of his way to seek them. These are the soul's mumps, and measles, and whooping coughs, etc. Emerson, Spiritual Laws. Notes sur la vie, page 1. See, for example, F. Paulhan, in his book Les Caractères, 1894, who contrasts les équilibres, les unifies, with les inquiets, les contrariants, les incoherents, les émiettes, as so many diverse psychic types. Annie Besant, an Autobiography, page 82. Smith Baker, in Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September, 1893. Louis Gourdon, Essai sur la Conversion de Saint Augustine, Paris, Fischbacher, 1900, has shown by an analysis of Augustine's writings immediately after the date of his conversion, d. 386, that the account he gives in the Confessions is premature. The crisis in the garden marked a definitive conversion from his former life, but it was to the Neoplatonic spiritualism and only a halfway stage toward Christianity. The latter he appears not fully and radically to have embraced until 4 years more had passed. Confessions, Book 8, Chaps. v. 7, 11, abridged. T. H. Geoffroy, Nouveaux Mélanges Philosophiques, Toomey edition, page 83. I add 2 other cases of counter-conversion dating from a certain moment. The first is from Professor Starbuck's manuscript collection, and the narrator is a woman. Away down in the bottom of my heart, I believe I was always more or less skeptical about God. Skepticism grew as an undercurrent, all through my early youth, but it was controlled and covered by the emotional elements in my religious growth. When I was 16 I joined the church and was asked if I loved God. I replied, yes, as was customary and expected. But instantly with a flash something spoke within me, no, you do not. I was haunted for a long time with shame and remorse for my falsehood and for my wickedness in not loving God, mingled with fear that there might be an avenging God who would punish me in some terrible way. At 19, I had an attack of tonsillitis. Before I had quite recovered, I heard told a story of a brute who had kicked his wife downstairs, and then continued the operation until she became insensible. I felt the horror of the thing keenly. Instantly this thought flashed through my mind, I have no use for a God who permits such things. This experience was followed by months of stoical indifference to the God of my previous life, mingled with feelings of positive dislike and a somewhat proud defiance of him. I still thought there might be a God. If so, he would probably damn me, but I should have to stand it. I felt very little fear and no desire to propitiate him. I have never had any personal relations with him since this painful experience. The second case exemplifies how small an additional stimulus will overthrow the mind into a new state of equilibrium when the process of preparation and incubation has proceeded far enough. It is like the proverbial last straw added to the camel's burden, or that touch of a needle which makes the salt in a supersaturated fluid suddenly begin to crystallize out. Tolstoy writes, S. A frank and intelligent man, told me as follows how he ceased to believe. He was 26 years old when one day on a hunting expedition, the time for sleep having come, he set himself to pray according to the custom he had held from childhood. His brother, who was hunting with him, lay upon the hay and looked at him. When S. had finished his prayer and was turning to sleep, the brother said, "Do you still keep up that thing?" Nothing more was said. But since that day, now more than 30 years ago, S. has never prayed again, he never takes communion, and does not go to church. All this, not because he became acquainted with convictions of his brother which he then and there adopted. Not because he made any new resolution in his soul, but merely because the words spoken by his brother were like the light push of a finger against a leaning wall already about to tumble by its own weight. These words but showed him that the place wherein he supposed religion dwelt in him had long been empty, and that the sentences he uttered, the crosses and bows which he made during his prayer, were actions with no inner sense. Having once seized their absurdity, he could no longer keep them up. My Confession, page 8. Op. Cit., Letter 3, abridged. I subjoin an additional document which has come into my possession, and which represents in a vivid way what is probably a very frequent sort of conversion, if the opposite of falling in love, falling out of love, may be so termed. Falling in love also conforms frequently to this type, a latent process of unconscious preparation often preceding a sudden awakening to the fact that the mischief is irretrievably done. The free and easy tone in this narrative gives it a sincerity that speaks for itself. For 2 years of this time I went through a very bad experience, which almost drove me mad. I had fallen violently in love with a girl who, young as she was, had a spirit of coquetry like a cat. As I look back on her now, I hate her, and wonder how I could ever have fallen so low as to be worked upon to such an extent by her attractions. Nevertheless, I fell into a regular fever, could think of nothing else. Whenever I was alone, I pictured her attractions, and spent most of the time when I should have been working, in recalling our previous interviews, and imagining future conversations. She was very pretty, good-humored, and jolly to the last degree, and intensely pleased with my admiration. Would give me no decided answer yes or no, and the queer thing about it was that whilst pursuing her for her hand, I secretly knew all along that she was unfit to be a wife for me, and that she never would say yes. Although for a year we took our meals at the same boarding house, so that I saw her continually and familiarly, our closer relations had to be largely on the sly, and this fact, together with my jealousy of another one of her male admirers, and my own conscience despising me for my uncontrollable weakness, made me so nervous and sleepless that I really thought I should become insane. I understand well those young men murdering their sweethearts, which appear so often in the papers. Nevertheless I did love her passionately, and in some ways she did deserve it. The queer thing was the sudden and unexpected way in which it all stopped. I was going to my work after breakfast one morning, thinking as usual of her and of my misery, when, just as if some outside power laid hold of me, I found myself turning round and almost running to my room, where I immediately got out all the relics of her which I possessed, including some hair, all her notes and letters, and ambrotypes on glass. The former I made a fire of, the latter I actually crushed beneath my heel, in a sort of fierce joy of revenge and punishment. I now loathed and despised her altogether, and as for myself I felt as if a load of disease had suddenly been removed from me. That was the end. I never spoke to her or wrote to her again in all the subsequent years, and I have never had a single moment of loving thought towards one who for so many months entirely filled my heart. In fact, I have always rather hated her memory, though now I can see that I had gone unnecessarily far in that direction. At any rate, from that happy morning onward I regained possession of my own proper soul, and have never since fallen into any similar trap. This seems to me an unusually clear example of two different levels of personality, inconsistent in their dictates, yet so well balanced against each other as for a long time to fill the life with discord and dissatisfaction. At last, not gradually, but in a sudden crisis, the unstable equilibrium is resolved, and this happens so unexpectedly that it is as if, to use the writer's words, some outside power laid hold. Professor Starbuck gives an analogous case, and a converse case of hatred suddenly turning into love, in his Psychology of Religion, page 141. Compare the other highly curious instances which he gives on pp. 137 to 144, of sudden non-religious alterations of habit or character. He seems right in conceiving all such sudden changes as results of special cerebral functions unconsciously developing until they are ready to play a controlling part, when they make irruption into the conscious life. When we treat of sudden conversion, I shall make as much use as I can of this hypothesis of subconscious incubation. H. Fletcher, Menticulture. Or the ABC of True Living, New York and Chicago, 1899, pages 26 to 36. Abridged. I have considerably abridged Tolstoy's words in my translation. In my quotations from Bunyan I have omitted certain intervening portions of the text. A sketch of the life of Stephen H. Bradley, from the age of 5 to 24 years, including his remarkable experience of the power of the Holy Spirit on the 2nd evening of November, 1829. Madison, Connecticut, 1830. Geoffroy is an example. Down this slope it was that my intelligence had glided, and little by little it had got far from its first faith. But this melancholy revolution had not taken place in the broad daylight of my consciousness. Too many scruples, too many guides, and sacred affections had made it dreadful to me, so that I was far from avowing to myself the progress it had made. It had gone on in silence, by an involuntary elaboration of which I was not the accomplice. And although I had in reality long ceased to be a Christian, yet, in the innocence of my intention, I should have shuddered to suspect it, and thought it calumny had I been accused of such a falling away. Then follows Geoffroy's account of his counter-conversion, quoted above on p. 1 hardly needs examples, but for love, cp. note. For fear, p. 4. Remorse, see Othello after the murder. For anger, see Lear after Cordelia's first speech to him. For resolve, cp. J. Foster case. Here is a pathological case in which guilt was the feeling that suddenly exploded. One night I was seized on entering bed with a rigor, such as Swedenborg describes as coming over him with a sense of holiness, but over me with a sense of guilt. During that whole night I lay under the influence of the rigor, and from its inception I felt that I was under the curse of God. I have never done one act of duty in my life, sins against God and man, beginning as far as my memory goes back, a wildcat in human shape. E. D. Starbuck, The Psychology of Religion, pages 224, 262. No one understands this better than Jonathan Edwards understood it already. Conversion narratives of the more commonplace sort must always be taken with the allowances which he suggests. A rule received and established by common consent has a very great, though to many persons an insensible influence in forming their notions of the process of their own experience. I know very well how they proceed. As to this matter, for I have had frequent opportunities of observing their conduct. Very often their experience at first Appears like a confused chaos, but then those parts are selected, which bear the nearest resemblance to such particular steps as are insisted on. And these are dwelt upon in their thoughts, and spoken of from time to time, till they grow more and more conspicuous in their view, and other parts which are neglected grow more and more obscure. Thus what they have experienced is insensibly strained, so as to bring it to an exact conformity to the scheme already established in their minds. And it becomes natural also for ministers, who have to deal with those who insist upon distinctness and clearness of method, to do so too. Treatise on Religious Affections. Studies in the Psychology of Religious Phenomena, American Journal of Psychology, 7. 309, 1896. I have abridged Mr. Hadley's account. For other conversions of drunkards, see his pamphlet, Rescue Mission Work, published at the Old Jerry Molly Water Street Mission, New York City. A striking collection of cases also appears in the appendix to Professor Luba's article. A restaurant waiter served provisionally as Goff's savior. General Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, considers that the first vital step in saving outcasts consists in making them feel that some decent human being cares enough for them to take an interest in the question whether they are to rise or sink. The crisis of apathetic melancholy, no use in life, into which J.S. Mill records that he fell, and from which he emerged by the reading of Marmontel's memoirs, Heaven Save the Mark. And Wordsworth's poetry, is another intellectual and general metaphysical case. See Mill's Autobiography, New York. 1873, pages 141, 148. Starbuck, in addition to Escape from Sin, discriminates spiritual illumination as a distinct type of conversion experience. Psychology of Religion, page 85. Psychology of Religion, page 117. Psychology of Religion, page 385. Compare, also, pp. 137 to 144 and 262. For instance, C. G. Finney italicizes the volitional element, just at this point. The whole question of gospel salvation opened to my mind in a manner most marvelous to me at the time. I think I then saw, as clearly as I ever have in my life, the reality and fullness of the atonement of Christ. Gospel salvation seemed to me to be an offer of something to be accepted, and all that was necessary on my part was to get my own consent to give up my sins and accept Christ. After this distinct revelation had stood for some little time before my mind, the question seemed to be put, will you accept it now, today? I replied, yes, I will accept it today, or I will die in the attempt. He then went into the woods, where he describes his struggles. He could not pray, his heart was hardened in its pride. I then reproached myself for having promised to give my heart to God before I left the woods. When I came to try, I found I could not. My inward soul hung back, and there was no going out of my heart to God. The thought was pressing me, of the rashness of my promise that I would give my heart to God that day, or die in the attempt. It seemed to me as if that was binding on my soul, and yet I was going to break my vow. A great sinking and discouragement came over me, and I felt almost too weak to stand upon my knees. Just at this moment I again thought I heard someone approach me, and I opened my eyes to see whether it were so. But right there the revelation of my pride of heart, as the great difficulty that stood in the way, was distinctly shown to me. An overwhelming sense of my wickedness in Being ashamed to have a human being see me on my knees before God took such powerful possession of me, that I cried at the top of my voice, and exclaimed that I would not leave that place if all the men on earth and all the devils in hell surrounded me. What? I said. Such a degraded sinner as I am, on my knees confessing my sins to the great and holy God, and ashamed to have any human being, and a sinner like myself, find me on my knees, endeavoring to make my peace with my offended God. The sin appeared awful, infinite. It broke me down before the Lord. Memoirs, pages 14-16, abridged. Starbuck, Op. Cit., pp. 91, 114. Extracts from the Journal of Mr. John Nelson, London, no date, page 24. Starbuck, page 64. Starbuck, page 115. Starbuck, page 113. Edwards and Dwight's Life of Brainerd. New Haven, 1822, pages 45-47, abridged. Describing the whole phenomenon as a change of equilibrium, we might say that the movement of new psychic energies towards the personal center and the recession of old ones towards the margin or the rising of some objects above, and the sinking of others below the conscious threshold, were only two ways of describing an indivisible event. Doubtless this is often absolutely true, and Starbuck is right when he says that self-surrender and new determination, though seeming at first sight to be such different experiences, are really the same thing. Self-surrender sees the change in terms of the old self, determination sees it in terms of the new. Op. Cit., page 160. A. A. Bonner, Nettleton and His Labors, Edinburgh, 1854, page 261. Charles G. Finney, Memoirs. Written by himself, 1876, pp. 17, 18. Life and Journals, Boston, 1806, pp. 31-40, abridged. My quotations are made from an Italian translation of this letter in the Biographia del Sig. M. A. Ratisbon, Ferrara, 1843, which I have to thank Monsignor D. O'Connell of Rome for bringing to my notice. I abridge the original, published in the International Scientific Series. The reader will here please notice that in my exclusive reliance in the last lecture on the subconscious incubation of motives deposited by a growing experience, I followed the method of employing accepted principles of explanation as far as one can. The subliminal region, whatever else it may be, is at any rate a place now admitted by psychologists to exist for the accumulation of vestiges of sensible experience, whether inattentively or attentively registered, and for their elaboration according to ordinary psychological or logical laws into results that end by attaining such a tension that they may at times enter consciousness with something like a burst. It thus is scientific to interpret all otherwise unaccountable invasive alterations of consciousness as results of the tension of subliminal memories reaching the bursting point. But candor obliges me to confess that there are occasional bursts into consciousness of results of which it is not easy to demonstrate any prolonged subconscious incubation. Some of the cases I used to illustrate the sense of presence of the unseen in lecture were of this order, compare pages. And we shall see other experiences of the kind when we come to the subject of mysticism. The case of Mr. Bradley, that of M. Ratisbon, possibly that of Colonel Gardiner, possibly that of St. Paul, might not be so easily explained in this simple way. The result, then, would have to be ascribed either to a merely physiological nerve storm, a discharging lesion like that of epilepsy, or, in case it were useful and rational, as in the two latter cases, named to some more mystical or theological hypothesis. I make this remark in order that the reader may realize that the subject is really complex. But I shall keep myself as far as possible at present to the more scientific view, and only as the plot thickens in subsequent lectures shall I consider the question of its absolute sufficiency as an explanation of all the facts. That subconscious incubation explains a great number of them, there can be no doubt. Edwards says elsewhere, I am bold to say that the work of God in the conversion of one soul, considered together with the source, foundation and purchase of it, and also the benefit, end, and eternal issue of it, is a more glorious work of God than the creation of the whole material universe. Emerson writes, when we see a soul whose acts are regal, graceful, and pleasant as roses, we must thank God that such things can be and are, and not turn sourly on the angel and say, Crump is a better man, with his grunting resistance to all his native devils. True enough. Yet Crump may really be the better Crump, for his inner discords and second birth, and your once born regal character, though indeed always better than poor Crump, may fall far short of what he individually might be had he only some Crump-like capacity for compunction over his own peculiar diabolisms. Graceful and pleasant, and invariably gentlemanly as these may be. In his book, The Spiritual Life, New York, 1900. Op. Cit., page 112. Op. Cit., page 144. I pieced together a quotation made by W. Mono, in his book La Vie, and a letter printed in the work. Adolphe Mono, I, Souvenirs de sa vie, 1885, page 433. Commentary on Galatians, ch. 3. Verse 19, and ch. 2. Verse 20, abridged. In some conversions, both steps are distinct. In this one, for example, whilst I was reading the evangelical treatise, I was soon struck by an expression, the finished work of Christ. Why, I asked of myself, does the author use these terms? Why does he not say, the atoning work? Then these words, it is finished, presented themselves to my mind. What is it that is finished? I asked, and in an instant my mind replied, a perfect expiation for sin, entire satisfaction has been given. The debt has been paid by the substitute. Christ has died for our sins, not for ours only, but for those of all men. If, then, the entire work is finished, all the debt paid, what remains for me to do? In another instant the light was shed through my mind by the Holy Ghost, and the joyous conviction was given me that nothing more was to be done, save to fall on my knees, to accept this Savior and His love, to praise God forever. Autobiography of Hudson Taylor. I translate back into English from the French translation of Cholland, Geneva, no date, the original not being accessible. Tolstoy's case was a good comment on those words. There was almost no theology in his conversion. His faith state was the sense come back that life was infinite in its moral significance. American Journal of Psychology, 7. 345-347, abridged. Above, p. Dwight, Life of Edwards. New York, 1830, page 61, abridged. W. F. Bourne, The King's Son, A Memoir of Billy Bray, London, Hamilton, Adams and Company. 1887, page 9. Consult William B. Sprague, Lectures on Revivals of Religion, New York. 1832, in the long appendix to which the opinions of a large number of ministers are given. Memoirs, page 34. These reports of sensorial fadism shade off into what are evidently only metaphorical accounts of the sense of new spiritual illumination, as, for instance, in Brainerd's statement, as I was walking in a thick grove. Unspeakable glory seemed to open to the apprehension of my soul. I do not mean any external brightness, for I saw no such thing, nor any imagination of a body of light in the third heavens, or anything of that nature, but it was a new inward apprehension or view that I had of God. In a case like this next one from Starbuck's manuscript collection, the lighting up of the darkness is probably also metaphorical. One Sunday night, I resolved that when I got home to the ranch where I was working, I would offer myself with my faculties and all to God to be used only by and for Him. It was raining and the roads were muddy, but this desire grew so strong that I kneeled down by the side of the road and told God all about it, intending then to get up and go on. Such a thing as any special answer to my prayer never entered my mind, having been converted by faith, but still being most undoubtedly saved. Well, while I was praying, I remember holding out my hands to God and telling Him they should work for Him, my feet walk for Him, my tongue speak for Him, etc., etc. If He would only use me as His instrument and give me a satisfying experience, when suddenly the darkness of the night seemed lit up, I felt, realized, knew, that God heard and answered my prayer. Deep happiness came over me. I felt I was accepted into the inner circle of God's loved ones. In the following case also the flash of light is metaphorical. A prayer meeting had been called for at close of evening service. The minister supposed me impressed by his discourse, a mistake, he was dull. He came and, placing his hand upon my shoulder, said, "Do you not want to give your heart to God?" I replied in the affirmative. Then said he, "Come to the front seat." They sang and prayed and talked with me. I experienced nothing but unaccountable wretchedness. They declared that the reason why I did not obtain peace was because I was not willing to give up all to God. After about 2 hours the minister said we would go home. As usual, on retiring, I prayed. In great distress, I at this time simply said, "Lord, I have done all I can, I leave the whole matter with Thee." Immediately, like a flash of light, there came to me a great peace, and I arose and went into my parents' bedroom and said, "I do feel so wonderfully happy." This I regard as the hour of conversion. It was the hour in which I became assured of divine acceptance and favor. So far as my life was concerned, it made little immediate change. I add in a note a few more records. One morning, being in deep distress, fearing every moment I should drop into hell, I was constrained to cry in earnest for mercy, and the Lord came to my relief, and delivered my soul from the burden and guilt of sin. My whole frame was in a tremor from head to foot, and my soul enjoyed sweet peace. The pleasure I then felt was indescribable. The happiness lasted about 3 days, during which time I never spoke to any person about my feelings. Autobiography of Dan Young, edited by W. P. Strickland, New York, 1860. In an instant there rose up in me such a sense of God's taking care of those who put their trust in Him that for an hour all the world was crystalline, the heavens were lucid, and I sprang to my feet and began to cry and laugh. H. W. Beecher, quoted by Loba. My tears of sorrow changed to joy, and I lay there praising God in such ecstasy of joy as only the soul who experiences it can realize. I cannot express how I felt. It was as if I had been in a dark dungeon and lifted into the light of the sun. I shouted and I sang praise unto Him who loved me and washed me from my sins. I was forced to retire into a secret place, for the tears did flow, and I did not wish my shopmates to see me, and yet I could not keep it a secret. I experienced joy almost to weeping. I felt my face must have shone like that of Moses. I had a general feeling of buoyancy. It was the greatest joy it was ever my lot to experience. I wept and laughed alternately. I was as light as if walking on air. I felt as if I had gained greater peace and happiness than I had ever expected to experience. Starbuck's Correspondence. Psychology of Religion, pages 360. 357. Sainte-Beuve, Port Royal. Volume 1, pages 95 and 106, abridged. Love would not be love, says Bourget, unless it could carry one to crime. And so one may say that no passion would be a veritable passion unless it could carry one to crime. Sihil, Psychologie de Sex, page 136. In other words, great passions annul the ordinary inhibitions set by conscience. And conversely, of all the criminal human beings, the false, cowardly, sensual, or cruel persons who actually live, there is perhaps not one whose criminal impulse may not be at some moment overpowered by the presence of some other emotion to which his character is also potentially liable, provided that other emotion be only made intense enough. Fear is usually the most available emotion for this result in this particular class of persons. It stands for conscience, and may here be classed appropriately as a higher affection. If we are soon to die, or if we believe a day of judgment to be near at hand, how quickly do we put our moral house in order, we do not see how sin can evermore exert temptation over us. Old-fashioned hellfire Christianity well knew how to extract from fear its full equivalent in the way of fruits for repentance, and its full conversion value. Example, Benjamin Constant was often marveled at as an extraordinary instance of superior intelligence with inferior character. He writes, Journal, Paris, 1895, page 56. I am tossed and dragged about by my miserable weakness. Never was anything so ridiculous as my indecision. Now marriage, now solitude, now Germany, now France. Hesitation upon hesitation, and all because at bottom I am unable to give up anything. He can't get mad at any of his alternatives. And the career of a man beset by such an all-round amiability is hopeless. The great thing which the higher excitabilities give is courage. And the addition or subtraction of a certain amount of this quality makes a different man, a different life. Various excitements let the courage loose. Trustful hope will do it, inspiring example will do it, love will do it, wrath will do it. In some people it is natively so high that the mere touch of danger does it, though danger is for most men the great inhibitor of action. Love of adventure becomes in such persons a ruling passion. I believe, says General Skobeleff, that my bravery is simply the passion and at the same time the contempt of danger. The risk of life fills me with an exaggerated rapture. The fewer there are to share it, the more I like it. The participation of my body in the event is required to furnish me an adequate excitement. Everything intellectual appears to me to be reflex. But a meeting of man to man, a duel, a danger into which I can throw myself head foremost, attracts me, moves me, intoxicates me. I am crazy for it, I love it, I adore it. I run after danger as one runs after women, I wish it never to stop. Were it always the same, it would always bring me a new pleasure. When I throw myself into an adventure in which I hope to find it, my heart palpitates with the uncertainty, I could wish at once to have it appear and yet to delay. A sort of painful and delicious shiver shakes me, my entire nature runs to meet the peril with an impetus that my will would in vain try to resist. Juliet Adam, Le General. Skobeleff, Nouvelle Revue, 1886, abridged. Skobeleff seems to have been a cruel egoist, but the disinterested Garibaldi, if one may judge by his memory, lived in an Unflagging emotion of similar danger-seeking excitement. See the case on p. above, where the writer describes his experiences of communion with the divine as consisting merely in the temporary obliteration of the conventionalities which usually cover my life. Above, p. The only radical remedy I know for dipsomania is religiomania, is a saying I have heard quoted from some medical man. Doddridge's Life of Colonel James Gardiner, London Religious Tract Society, pages 23-32. Here, for example, is a case, from Starbuck's book, in which a sensory automatism brought about quickly what prayers and resolves had been unable to effect. The subject is a woman. She writes, "When I was about 40 I tried to quit smoking, but the desire was on me, and had me in its power. I cried and prayed and promised God to quit, but could not. I had smoked for 15 years. When I was 53, as I sat by the fire one day smoking, a voice came to me. I did not hear it with my ears, but more as a dream or sort of double think. It said, 'Louisa, lay down smoking.' At once I replied, 'Will you take the desire away?' But it only kept saying, 'Louisa, lay down smoking.' Then I got up, laid my pipe on the mantel shelf, and never smoked again or had any desire to. The desire was gone as though I had never known it or touched tobacco. The sight of others smoking and the smell of smoke never gave me the least wish to touch it again." The Psychology of Religion, page 142. Professor Starbuck expresses the radical destruction of old influences physiologically, as a cutting off of the connection between higher and lower cerebral centers. This condition, he says, in which the association centers connected with the spiritual life are cut off from the lower, is often reflected in the way correspondents describe their experiences. For example, temptations from without still assail me, but there is nothing within to respond to them. The ego, here, is wholly identified with the higher centers, whose quality of feeling is that of withinness. Another of the respondents says, "Since then, although Satan tempts me, there is as it were a wall of brass around me, so that his darts cannot touch me." Unquestionably, functional exclusions of this sort must occur in the cerebral organ. But on the side accessible to introspection, their causal condition is nothing but the degree of spiritual excitement, getting at last so high and strong as to be sovereign. And it must be frankly confessed that we do not know just why or how such sovereignty comes about in one person and not in another. We can only give our imagination a certain delusive help by mechanical analogies. If we should conceive, for example, that the human mind, with its different possibilities of equilibrium, might be like a many-sided solid with different surfaces on which it could lie flat, we might liken mental revolutions to the spatial revolutions of such a body. As it is pried up, say by a lever, from a position in which it lies on surface A, for instance, it will linger for a time unstably halfway up, and if the lever cease to urge it, it will tumble back or relapse under the continued pull of gravity. But if at last it rotate far enough for its center of gravity to pass beyond surface A altogether, the body will fall over, on surface B, say, and abide there permanently. The pulls of gravity towards A have vanished, and may now be disregarded. The polyhedron has become immune against farther attraction from their direction. In this figure of speech the lever may correspond to the emotional influences making for a new life, and the initial pull of gravity to the ancient drawbacks and inhibitions. So long as the emotional influence fails to reach a certain pitch of efficacy, the changes it produces are unstable, and the man relapses into his original attitude. But when a certain intensity is attained by the new emotion, a critical point is passed, and there then ensues an irreversible revolution, equivalent to the production of a new nature. I use this word in spite of a certain flavor of sanctimoniousness which sometimes clings to it, because no other word suggests as well the exact combination of affections which the text goes on to describe. It will be found, says Drive W. R. Inga, in his Lectures on Christian Mysticism, London, 1899, page 326. That men of preeminent saintliness agree very closely in what they tell us. They tell us that they have arrived at an unshakable conviction, not based on inference but on immediate experience, that God is a spirit with whom the human spirit can hold intercourse. That in him meet all that they can imagine of goodness, truth, and beauty. That they can see his footprints everywhere in nature, and feel his presence within them as the very life of their life, so that in proportion as they come to themselves they come to him. They tell us what separates us from him and from happiness is, first, self-seeking in all its forms. And, secondly, sensuality in all its forms, that these are the ways of darkness and death, which hide from us the face of God. While the path of the just is like a shining light, which shineth more and more unto the perfect day. The enthusiasm of humanity may lead to a life which coalesces in many respects with that of Christian saintliness. Take the following rules proposed to members of the Union pour l'Action Morale, in the Bulletin de l'Union, April 1 to 15, 1894. See, also, Revue Bluey, August 13, 1892. We would make known in our own persons the usefulness of rule, of discipline, of resignation and renunciation. We would teach the necessary perpetuity of suffering, and explain the creative part which it plays. We would wage war upon false optimism, on the base hope of happiness coming to us ready-made. On the notion of a salvation by knowledge alone, or by material civilization alone, vain symbol as this is of civilization, precarious external arrangement, ill-fitted to replace the intimate union and consent of souls. We would wage war also on bad morals, whether in public or in private life, on luxury, fastidiousness, and over-refinement, on all that tends to increase the painful, immoral, and antisocial multiplication of our wants. On all that excites envy and dislike in the soul of the common people, and confirms the notion that the chief end of life is freedom to enjoy. We would preach by our example the respect of superiors and equals, the respect of all men. Affectionate simplicity in our relations with inferiors and insignificant persons, indulgence where our own claims only are concerned, but firmness in our demands where they relate to duties towards others or towards the public. For the common people are what we help them to become, their vices are our vices, gazed upon, envied, and imitated, and if they come back with all their weight upon us, it is but just. Above, pages ff. H. Thoreau, Walden. Riverside Edition, p. 206, abridged. C. H. Hilty, Gluck, Volume I, page 85. The Mystery of Pain and Death, London. 1892, page 258. Compare Madame Guyon. It was my practice to arise at midnight for purposes of devotion. It seemed to me that God came at the precise time and woke me from sleep in order that I might enjoy him. When I was out of health or greatly fatigued, he did not awake me, but at such times I felt, even in my sleep, a singular possession of God. He loved me so much that he seemed to pervade my being, at a time when I could be only imperfectly conscious of his presence. My sleep is sometimes broken, a sort of half-sleep. But my soul seems to be awake enough to know God, when it is hardly capable of knowing anything else. T. C. Upham, The Life and Religious Experiences of Madame de la Motte Guyon, New York, 1877. Volume 1, page 260. I have considerably abridged the words of the original, which is given in Edwards's narrative of the Revival in New England. Bougaud, Histoire de la Bienheureuse Marguerite Marie, 1894, page 125. Paris, 1900. Page 130. Page 167. Op. Cit. p. 127. The barrier between men and animals. Also. We read of Toyansky, an eminent Polish patriot and mystic. That, one day one of his friends met him in the rain, caressing a big dog which was jumping upon him and covering him horribly with mud. On being asked why he permitted the animal thus to dirty his clothes, Toyansky replied, "This dog, whom I am now meeting for the first time, has shown a great fellow feeling for me, and a great joy in my recognition and acceptance of his greetings. Were I to drive him off, I should wound his feelings and do him a moral injury. It would be an offense not only to him, but to all the spirits of the other world who are on the same level with him. The damage which he does to my coat is as nothing in comparison with the wrong which I should inflict upon him, in case I were to remain indifferent to the manifestations of his friendship. We ought," he added, "both to lighten the condition of animals, whenever we can, and at the same time to facilitate in ourselves that union of the world of all spirits, which the sacrifice of Christ has made possible." Andrei Toyansky. Traduction de l'Italien, Turin, 1897, privately printed. I owe my knowledge of this book and of Toyansky to my friend Professor W. Lutoslawski, author of Plato's Logic. J. Patterson's Life of Richard Weaver, pp. 66-68, abridged. As where the future Buddha, incarnated as a hare, jumps into the fire to cook himself for a meal for a beggar, having previously shaken himself 3 times, so that none of the insects in his fur should perish with him. Bulletin de l'Union pour l'Action. Morale, September, 1894. B. Pascal, Prières pour les maladies, sections 13, 14, abridged. From Thomas C. Upham's Life and Religious Opinions and Experiences. Of Madame de la Mothe Guyon, New York, 1877, 2. 48, I. 141, 413. Abridged. Op. Cit., London, 1901, page 130. Claparede Igati, du Héroïnes de la Foi, Paris, 1880, page 112. Compare these 3 different statements of it. P. Call, as a matter of course, Boston, 1894, H. W. Dresser, Living by the Spirit, New York and London, 1900, H. W. Smith, The Christian's Secret of a Happy Life. Published by the Willard Tract Repository, and now in thousands of hands. T. C. Upham, Life of Madame Catherine Adorna, 3d ed. New York, 1864, pages 158. 172-174. The History of Thomas Elwood, written by himself, London, 1885, pp. 32-34. Memoirs of W. E. Channing, Boston. 1840, I. 196. L. Tyerman, The Life and Times of the Reverend John Wesley, I. 274. A. Mounin, Le Cure d'Ars. Vie de M. J. B. M. Vianney, 1864, page 545, abridged. B. Wendell, Cotton Mather. New York, no date, page 198. That of the earlier Jesuit Rodriguez, which has been translated into all languages, is one of the best known. A convenient modern manual, very well put together, is L'Ascétique chrétienne, by M. J. Ribbet, Paris. Poussielgue, Nouvelle Edition, 1898. Saint-Jean Delaware Lacroix. Vie et Ouvre, Paris, 1893, 2. 94, 99, abridged. Insects, i.e. lice, were an unfailing token of medieval sainthood. We read of Francis of Assisi's sheepskin that often a companion of the saint would take it to the fire to clean and dispediculate it, doing so, as he said, because the seraphic father himself was no enemy of pedochy, but on the contrary kept them on him, lo portava addosso, and held it for an honor and a glory to wear these celestial pearls in his habit. Quoted by P. Sabatier, Speculum Perfectionis, etc., Paris, 1898, page 231, note. The Life of the Blessed Henry. Suso, by himself, translated by T. F. Knox, London, 1865, pages 56 to 80, abridged. Bougod, Hist. de la Bienheureuse Marguerite Marie, Paris, 1894, pages 265, 171. Compare. Also, pages 386, 387. Lejeune, Introduction à la Vie Mystique, 1899, page 277. The Holocaust simile goes back at least as far as Ignatius Loyola. Alfonso Rodriguez, S.J. Pratique de la Perfection Chrétienne, Part 3, Treatise v. Ch. X. Letters Li and CXX. Of the collection. Translated into French by Boix, Paris, 1870. Bartoli Michel, 2. 13. Rodriguez, Op Cit, Part 3, Treatise v. Ch. 6. Saint-Beuve, Histoire de Port Royal, I. 346. Rodriguez, Op Cit, Part 3, Treatise 3, Chaps 6, 7. R. Philip, The Life and Times of George Whitefield, London, 1842, page 366. Edward Carpenter, Towards Democracy, page 362, abridged. Speculum Perfectionis, ed. P. Sabatier, Paris, 1898, pages 10, 13. An Apology for M. Antonia Bourignon, London, 1699, pages 269, 270, abridged. Another example from Starbucks MS. Collection. At a meeting held at 6 the next morning, I heard a man relate his experience. He said, the Lord asked him if he would confess Christ among the quarrymen with whom he worked, and he said he would. Then he asked him if he would give up to be used of the Lord the $400 he had laid up, and he said he would, and thus the Lord saved him. The thought came to me at once that I had never made a real consecration either of myself or of my property to the Lord, but had always tried to serve the Lord in my way. Now the Lord asked me if I would serve him in his way, and go out alone and penniless if he so ordered. The question was pressed home, and I must decide, to forsake all and have him, or have all and lose him. I soon decided to take him. And the blessed assurance came, that he had taken me for his own, and my joy was full. I returned home from the meeting with feelings as simple as a child. I thought all would be glad to hear of the joy of the Lord that possessed me, and so I began to tell the simple story. But to my great surprise, the pastors, for I attended meetings in 3 churches, opposed the experience and said it was fanaticism, and one told the members of his church to shun those that professed it. And I soon found that my foes were those of my own household. J. J. Chapman, in the Political Nursery, Volume 4. Page 4, April, 1900, abridged. George Fox, Journal. Philadelphia, 1800, pages 59 to 61, abridged. Christian saints have had their specialties of devotion, Saint Francis to Christ's wounds. Saint Anthony of Padua to Christ's childhood, Saint Bernard to his humanity, Saint Teresa to Saint Joseph, etc. The Shiite Mohammedans venerate Ali, the Prophet's son-in-law, instead of Abu Bakr, his brother-in-law. Vambury describes a dervish whom he met in Persia, who had solemnly vowed 30 years before, that he would never employ his organs of speech otherwise but in uttering, everlastingly, the name of his favorite, Ali, Ali. He thus wished to signify to the world that he was the most devoted partisan of that Ali who had been dead 1,000 years. In his own home, speaking with his wife, children, and friends, no other word but Ali ever passed his lips. If he wanted food or drink or anything else, he expressed his want still by repeating Ali. Begging or buying at the bazaar, it was always Ali. Treated ill or generously, he would still harp on his monotonous Ali. Latterly his zeal assumed such tremendous proportions that, like a madman, he would race, the whole day, up and down the streets of the town, throwing his stick high up into the air, and shriek out all the while, at the top of his voice, Ali. This dervish was venerated by everybody as a saint, and received everywhere with the greatest distinction. Arminius Vambury, His Life and Adventures, written by himself, London, 1889, page 69. On the anniversary of the death of Hussein, Ali's son, the Shiite Muslims still make the air resound with cries of his name and Ali's. Compare H. C. Warren, Buddhism in Translation, Cambridge, U.S. 1898, Passim. Compare J. L. Merrick, The Life and Religion of Muhammad, as contained in the Shia Traditions of the Hayatollah, Boston. 1850, Passim. Bougad, Histoire de la Bienheureuse Marguerite Marie, Paris, 1894, page 145. Bougad, Hist. de la Bienheureuse Marguerite Marie, Paris, 1894, pages 365, 241. Bougad, Op. Cit. p. 267. Examples: suffering from a headache, she sought, for the glory of God, to relieve herself by holding certain odoriferous substances in her mouth, when the Lord appeared to her to lean over towards her lovingly, and to find comfort himself in these odors. After having gently breathed them in, he arose, and said with a gratified air to the saints, as if contented with what he had done, "See the new present which my betrothed has given me." One day, at chapel, she heard supernaturally sung the words, "Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus." The Son of God, leaning towards her like a sweet lover, and giving to her soul the softest kiss, said to her at the second Sanctus, "In this Sanctus addressed to my person, receive with this kiss all the sanctity of my divinity and of my humanity. And let it be to thee a sufficient preparation for approaching the communion table." And the next following Sunday, while she was thanking God for this favor, behold, the Son of God, more beauteous than thousands of angels, takes her in his arms as if he were proud of her, and presents her to God the Father, in that perfection of sanctity with which he had dowered her. And the Father took such delight in this soul thus presented by his only Son, that, as if unable longer to restrain himself, he gave her, and the Holy Ghost gave her also the sanctity attributed to each by his own Sanctus, and thus she remained endowed with the plenary fullness of the blessing of sanctity, bestowed on her by omnipotence, by wisdom, and by love. Revelations de Sainte Gertrude, Paris, 1898, I. 44, 186. Furneaux Jordan, Character. In Birth and Parentage, First Edition. Later editions changed the nomenclature. As to this distinction, see the admirably practical account in J. M. Baldwin's little book, The Story of the Mind. 1898. On this subject I refer to the work of M. Muricier, Les Maladies du Sentiment Religieux, Paris. 1901, who makes inner unification the mainspring of the whole religious life. But all strongly ideal interests, religious or irreligious, unify the mind and tend to subordinate Everything to themselves. One would infer from M. Muracier's pages that this formal condition was peculiarly characteristic of religion, and that one might in comparison almost neglect material content in studying the latter. I trust that the present work will convince the reader that religion has plenty of material content, which is characteristic, and which is more important by far than any general psychological form. In spite of this criticism, I find M. Muracier's book highly instructive. Example, at the first beginning of the servitor's, Susso's, interior life, after he had purified his soul properly by confession, he marked out for himself, in thought, 3 circles, within which he shut himself up, as in a spiritual entrenchment. The first circle was his cell, his chapel, and the choir. When he was within this circle, he seemed to himself in complete security. The second circle was the whole monastery as far as the outer gate. The third and outermost circle was the gate itself, and here it was necessary for him to stand well upon his guard. When he went outside these circles, it seemed to him that he was in the plight of some wild animal which is outside its hole, and surrounded by the hunt, and therefore in need of all its cunning and watchfulness. The Life of the Blessed Henry Susso, by himself, translated by Knox, London, 1865, p. 168. Vie de premières religieuses. Dominicaines de la Congregation de Saint-Dominique, à Nancy, Nancy. 1896, page 129. Messler's Life of Saint Louis of Gonzaga, French translation by Lebrequier, 1891, p. 40. In his boyish notebook he praises the monastic life for its freedom from sin, and for the imperishable treasures, which it enables us to store up, of merit in God's eyes, which makes of him our debtor for all eternity. Locke, Cit., page 62. Mademoiselle Maury, a novel quoted in Hare's Walks in Rome, 1900, I. 55. I cannot resist the temptation to quote from Starbuck's book, page 388, another case of purification by elimination. It runs as follows. The signs of abnormality which sanctified persons show are of frequent occurrence. They get out of tune with other people, often they will have nothing to do with churches, which they regard as worldly. They become hypercritical towards others, they grow careless of their social, political, and financial obligations. As an instance of this type may be mentioned a woman of 68 of whom the writer made a special study. She had been a member of one of the most active and progressive churches in a busy part of a large city. Her pastor described her as having reached the censorious stage. She had grown more and more out of sympathy with the church. Her connection with it finally consisted simply in attendance at prayer meeting, at which her only message was that of reproof and condemnation of the others for living on a low plane. At last she withdrew from fellowship with any church. The writer found her living alone in a little room on the top story of a cheap boarding house, quite out of touch with all human relations, but apparently happy in the enjoyment of her own spiritual blessings. Her time was occupied in writing booklets on sanctification, page after page of dreamy rhapsody. She proved to be one of a small group of persons who claim that entire salvation involves 3 steps instead of 2. Not only must there be conversion and sanctification, but a third, which they call crucifixion or perfect redemption, and which seems to bear the same relation to sanctification that this bears to conversion. She related how the Spirit had said to her, "Stop going to church. Stop going to holiness meetings. Go to your own room and I will teach you." She professes to care nothing for colleges, or preachers, or churches, but only cares to listen to what God says to her. Her description of her experience seemed entirely consistent. She is happy and contented, and her life is entirely satisfactory to herself. While listening to her own story, one was tempted to forget that it was from the life of a person who could not live by it in conjunction with her fellows. The best missionary lives abound in the victorious combination of non-resistance with personal authority. John G. Paton, for example, in the New Hebrides, among brutish Melanesian cannibals, preserves a charmed life by dint of it. When it comes to the point, no one ever dares actually to strike him. Native converts, inspired by him, showed analogous virtue. One of our chiefs, full of the Christ-kindled desire to seek and to save, sent a message to an inland chief, that he and 4 attendants would come on Sabbath and tell them the gospel of Jehovah God. The reply came back sternly forbidding their visit, and threatening with death any Christian that approached their village. Our chief sent in response a loving message, telling them that Jehovah had taught the Christians to return good for evil, and that they would come unarmed to tell them the story of how the Son of God came into the world and died in order to bless and save his enemies. The heathen chief sent back a stern and prompt reply once more, "If you come, you will be killed." On Sabbath morn the Christian chief and his 4 companions were met outside the village by the heathen chief, who implored and threatened them once more. But the former said, "We come to you without weapons of war. We come only to tell you about Jesus. We believe that he will protect us today." As they pressed steadily forward towards the village, spears began to be thrown at them. Some they evaded, being all except 1 dexterous warriors. And others they literally received with their bare hands, and turned them aside in an incredible manner. The heathen, apparently thunderstruck at these men thus approaching them without weapons of war, and not even flinging back their own spears which they had caught, after having thrown what the old chief called a shower of spears, desisted from mere surprise. Our Christian chief called out, as he and his companions drew up in the midst of them on the village public ground, "Jehovah thus protects us. He has given us all your spears. Once we would have thrown them back at you and killed you. But now we come, not to fight but to tell you about Jesus. He has changed our dark hearts. He asks you now to lay down all these your other weapons of war, and to hear what we can tell you about the love of God, our great Father, the only living God." The heathen were perfectly overawed. They manifestly looked on these Christians as protected by some invisible one. They listened for the first time to the story of the gospel and of the cross. We lived to see that chief and all his tribe sitting in the school of Christ. And there is perhaps not an island in these southern seas, amongst all those won for Christ, where similar acts of heroism on the part of converts cannot be recited. John G. Paton, Missionary to the New Hebrides, An Autobiography, 2nd part, London, 1890, page 243. St. Peter, St. Teresa tells us in her autobiography, French translation, p. 333, had passed 40 years without ever sleeping more than an hour and a half a day. Of all his mortifications, this was the one that had cost him the most. To compass it, he kept always on his knees or on his feet. The little sleep he allowed nature to take was snatched in a sitting posture, his head leaning against a piece of wood fixed in the wall. Even had he wished to lie down, it would have been impossible, because his cell was only 4 feet and a half long. In the course of all these years he never raised his hood, no matter what the ardor of the sun or the rain's strength. He never put on a shoe. He wore a garment of coarse sackcloth, with nothing else upon his skin. This garment was as scant as possible, and over it a little cloak of the same stuff. When the cold was great he took off the cloak and opened for a while the door and little window of his cell. Then he closed them and resumed the mantle, his way, as he told us, of warming himself, and making his body feel a better temperature. It was a frequent thing with him to eat once only in 3 days, and when I expressed my surprise, he said that it was very easy if one once had acquired the habit. One of his companions has assured me that he has gone sometimes 8 days without food. His poverty was extreme. And his mortification, even in his youth, was such that he told me he had passed 3 years in a house of his order without knowing any of the monks otherwise than by the sound of their voice, for he never raised his eyes, and only found his way about by following the others. He showed this same modesty on public highways. He spent many years without ever laying eyes upon a woman, but he confessed to me that at the age he had reached it was indifferent to him whether he laid eyes on them or not. He was very old when I first came to know him, and his body so attenuated that it seemed formed of nothing so much as of so many roots of trees. With all this sanctity he was very affable. He never spoke unless he was questioned, but his intellectual right-mindedness and grace gave to all his words an irresistible charm. F. Max Muller. Ramankrishna, His Life and Sayings, 1899, page 180. Oldenburg, Buddha. Translated by W. Hoey, London, 1882, p. 127. The vanities of all others may die out, but the vanity of a saint as regards his sainthood is hard indeed to wear away. Ramankrishna, His Life and Sayings, 1899, page 172. When a church has to be run by oysters, ice cream, and fun, I read in an American religious paper, you may be sure that it is running away from Christ. Such, if one may judge by appearances, is the present plight of many of our churches. C. V. B. K. Friedens, U.N.D. Kriegsmoral der hier. Quoted by Hamann, Psychology du Militaire Professional, 1895, p. Zli. Zur Genealogie der Moral, Dritt. Abhandlung, Section 14. I have abridged, and in one place transposed, a sentence. We all know daft saints, and they inspire a queer kind of aversion. But in comparing saints with strong men we must choose individuals on the same intellectual level. The underwitted strong man, homologous in his sphere with the underwitted saint, is the bully of the slums, the hooligan or rowdy. Surely on this level also the saint preserves a certain superiority. See above, p. Above, pages. Newman Securus Judicat Orbis. Terrorum is another instance. Mesopotamia is the stock comic instance. An excellent old German lady, who had done some travelling in her day, used to describe to me her Sehnsucht that she might yet visit Philadelphia, whose wondrous name had always haunted her imagination. Of John Foster it is said that single words, as Chalcedony, or the names of ancient heroes, had a mighty fascination over him. At any time the word hermit was enough to transport him. The words woods and forests would produce the most powerful emotion. Foster's Life, by Ryland, New York, 1846, p. 3. The Two Voices. In a letter to Mr. B. P. Blood, Tennyson reports of himself as follows. I have never had any revelations through anesthetics, but a kind of waking trance, this for lack of a better word, I have frequently had, quite up from boyhood, when I have been all alone. This has come upon me through repeating my own name to myself silently, till all at once, as it were out of the intensity of the consciousness of individuality, individuality itself seemed to dissolve and fade away into boundless being. And this not a confused state but the clearest, the surest of the surest, utterly beyond words, where death was an almost laughable impossibility, the loss of personality, if so it were, seeming no extinction, but the only true life. I am ashamed of my feeble description. Have I not said the state is utterly beyond words? Professor Tyndall, in a letter, recalls Tennyson's saying of this condition, "By God Almighty." There is no delusion in the matter. It is no nebulous ecstasy, but a state of transcendent wonder, associated with absolute clearness of mind. Memoirs of Alfred Tennyson, 2. 473. The Lancet, July 6 and 13, 1895. Reprinted as the Cavendish Lecture, on Dreamy Mental States. London, Ballier, 1895. They have been a good deal discussed of late by psychologists. See, for example, Bernard Leroy, L'Illusion. De Fausse Reconnaissance, Paris, 1898. Charles Kingsley's Life, I. 55, quoted. By Inga, Christian Mysticism. London, 1899, page 341. H. F. Brown, J. A. Simons, A Biography, London, 1895, pp. 29-31, abridged. Creighton Brown expressly says that Simons's highest nerve centers were in some degree enfeebled or damaged by these dreamy mental states, which afflicted him so grievously. Simons was, however, a perfect monster of many-sided cerebral efficiency, and his critic gives no objective grounds whatever for his strange opinion, save that Simons complained occasionally, as all susceptible and ambitious men complain, of lassitude and uncertainty as to his life's mission. What reader of Hegel can doubt that? That sense of a perfected being with all its otherness soaked up into itself, which dominates his whole philosophy, must have come from the prominence in his consciousness of mystical moods like this, in most persons kept subliminal. The notion is thoroughly characteristic of the mystical level, and the off-gabe of making it articulate was surely set to Hegel's intellect by mystical feeling. Benjamin Paul Blood, The Anesthetic Revelation and the Gist of Philosophy, Amsterdam, N. Y., 1874, pages 35, 36. Mr. Blood has made several attempts to adumbrate the anesthetic revelation, in pamphlets of rare literary distinction, privately printed and distributed by himself at Amsterdam. Zenos Clark, a philosopher, who died young at Amherst in the 80s, much lamented by those who knew him, was also impressed by the revelation. In the first place, he once wrote to me, Mr. Blood and I agree that the revelation is, if anything, non-emotional. It is utterly flat. It is, as Mr. Blood says, the one sole and sufficient insight why, or not why, but how, the present is pushed on by the past, and sucked forward by the vacuity of the future. Its inevitableness defeats all attempts at stopping or accounting for it. It is all precedence and presupposition, and questioning is in regard to it forever too late. It is an initiation of the past. The real secret would be the formula by which the now keeps exfoliating out of itself, yet never escapes. What is it, indeed, that keeps existence exfoliating? The formal being of anything, the logical definition of it, is static. For mere logic every question contains its own answer, we simply fill the hole with the dirt we dug out. Why are twice 2 4? Because, in fact, 4 is twice 2. Thus logic finds in life no propulsion, only a momentum. It goes because it is a going. But the revelation adds, it goes because it is and was a going. You walk, as it were, round yourself in the revelation. Ordinary philosophy is like a hound hunting his own trail. The more he hunts the farther he has to go, and his nose never catches up with his heels, because it is forever ahead of them. So the present is already a foregone conclusion, and I am ever too late to understand it. But at the moment of recovery from anesthesis, just then, before starting on life, I catch, so to speak, a glimpse of my heels, a glimpse of the eternal process just in the act of starting. The truth is that we travel on a journey that was accomplished before we set out. And the real end of philosophy is accomplished, not when we arrive at, but when we remain in, our destination, being already there, which may occur vicariously in this life when we cease our intellectual questioning. That is why there is a smile upon the face of the revelation, as we view it. It tells us that we are forever half a second too late, that's all. You could kiss your own lips, and have all the fun to yourself, it says, if you only knew the trick. It would be perfectly easy if they would just stay there till you got round to them. Why don't you manage it somehow? Dialectically minded readers of this farrago will at least recognize the region of thought of which Mr. Clarke writes, as familiar. In his latest pamphlet, Tennyson's Trances and the Anesthetic Revelation, Mr. Blood describes its value for life as follows. The anesthetic revelation is the initiation of man into the immemorial mystery of the open secret of being, revealed as the inevitable vortex of continuity. Inevitable is the word. Its motive is inherent, it is what has to be. It is not for any love or hate, nor for joy nor sorrow, nor good nor ill. End, beginning, or purpose, it knows not of. It affords no particular of the multiplicity and variety of things. But it fills appreciation of the historical and the sacred with a secular and intimately personal illumination of the nature and motive of existence, which then seems reminiscent, as if it should have appeared, or shall yet appear, to every participant thereof. Although it is at first startling in its solemnity, it becomes directly such a matter of course, so old-fashioned, and so akin to proverbs, that it inspires exultation rather than fear, and a sense of safety, as identified with the aboriginal and the universal. But no words may express the imposing certainty of the patient that he is realizing the primordial, Adamic surprise of life. Repetition of the experience finds it ever the same, and as if it could not possibly be otherwise. The subject resumes his normal consciousness only to partially and fitfully remember its occurrence, and to try to formulate its baffling import, with only this consolatory afterthought, that he has known the oldest truth. And that he has done with human theories as to the origin, meaning, or destiny of the race. He is beyond instruction in spiritual things. The lesson is one of central safety, the kingdom is within. All days are judgment days, but there can be no climacteric purpose of eternity, nor any scheme of the whole. The astronomer abridges the row of bewildering figures by increasing his unit of measurement, so may we reduce the distracting multiplicity of things to the unity for which each of us stands. This has been my moral sustenance since I have known of it. In my first printed mention of it I declared, the world is no more the alien terror that was taught me. Spurning the cloud-grimed and still sultry battlements whence so lately Jehovan thunders boomed, my grey gull lifts her wing against the nightfall, and takes the dim leagues with a fearless eye. And now, after 27 years of this experience, the wing is greyer, but the eye is fearless still, while I renew and doubly emphasize that declaration. I know, as having known, the meaning of existence, the sane center of the universe, at once the wonder and the assurance of the soul, for which the speech of reason has as yet no name but the anesthetic revelation. I have considerably abridged the quotation. Op. Cit., pages 78 to 80, abridged. I subjoin, also abridging it, another interesting anesthetic revelation communicated to me in manuscript by a friend in England. The subject, a gifted woman, was taking ether for a surgical operation. I wondered if I was in a prison being tortured, and why I remembered having heard it said that people learn through suffering, and in view of what I was seeing, the inadequacy of this saying struck me so much that I said, aloud, "To suffer is to learn." With that I became unconscious again, and my last dream immediately preceded my real coming to. It only lasted a few seconds, and was most vivid and real to me, though it may not be clear in words. A great being or power was traveling through the sky. His foot was on a kind of lightning as a wheel is on a rail, it was his pathway. The lightning was made entirely of the spirits of innumerable people close to one another, and I was one of them. He moved in a straight line, and each part of the streak or flash came into its short conscious existence only that he might travel. I seemed to be directly under the foot of God, and I thought he was grinding his own life up out of my pain. Then I saw that what he had been trying with all his might to do was to change his course, to bend the line of lightning to which he was tied, in the direction in which he wanted to go. I felt my flexibility and helplessness, and knew that he would succeed. He bended me, turning his corner by means of my hurt, hurting me more than I had ever been hurt in my life, and at the acutest point of this, as he passed, I saw. I understood for a moment things that I have now forgotten, things that no one could remember while retaining sanity. The angle was an obtuse angle, and I remember thinking as I woke that had he made it a right or acute angle, I should have both suffered and seen still more, and should probably have died. He went on and I came to. In that moment the whole of my life passed before me, including each little meaningless piece of distress, and I understood them. This was what it had all meant, this was the piece of work it had all been contributing to do. I did not see God's purpose, I only saw his intentness and his entire relentlessness towards his means. He thought no more of me than a man thinks of hurting a cork when he is opening wine, or hurting a cartridge when he is firing. And yet, on waking, my first feeling was, and it came with tears, Domini non sum digna, for I had been lifted into a position for which I was too small. I realized that in that half hour under ether I had served God more distinctly and purely than I had ever done in my life before, or that I am capable of desiring to do. I was the means of his achieving and revealing something, I know not what or to whom, and that, to the exact extent of my capacity for suffering. While regaining consciousness, I wondered why, since I had gone so deep, I had seen nothing of what the saints call the love of God, nothing but his relentlessness. And then I heard an answer, which I could only just catch, saying, knowledge and love are one, and the measure is suffering. I give the words as they came to me. With that I came finally into what seemed a dream world compared with the reality of what I was leaving, and I saw that what would be called the cause of my experience was a slight operation under insufficient ether. In a bed pushed up against a window, a common city window in a common city street. If I had to formulate a few of the things I then caught a glimpse of, they would run somewhat as follows. The eternal necessity of suffering and its eternal vicariousness. The veiled and incommunicable nature of the worst sufferings. The passivity of genius, how it is essentially instrumental and defenseless, moved, not moving, it must do what it does, the impossibility of discovery without its price. Finally, the excess of what the suffering seer or genius pays over what his generation gains. He seems like one who sweats his life out to earn enough to save a district from famine, and just as he staggers back, dying and satisfied, bringing a lakh of rupees to buy grain with, God lifts the lakh away, dropping 1 rupee, and says, "That you may give them. That you have earned for them. The rest is for me." I perceived also in a way never to be forgotten, the excess of what we see over what we can demonstrate. And so on, these things may seem to you delusions, or truisms. But for me they are dark truths, and the power to put them into even such words as these has been given me by an ether dream. In tune with the infinite, p. 137. The larger God may then swallow up the smaller one. I take this from Starbuck's manuscript collection. I never lost the consciousness of the presence of God until I stood at the foot of the Horseshoe Falls, Niagara. Then I lost him in the immensity of what I saw. I also lost myself, feeling that I was an atom too small for the notice of Almighty God. I subjoin another similar case from Starbuck's collection. In that time the consciousness of God's nearness came to me sometimes. I say God, to describe what is indescribable. A presence, I might say, yet that is too suggestive of personality, and the moments of which I speak did not hold the consciousness of a personality, but something in myself made me feel myself a part of something bigger than I. That was controlling. I felt myself one with the grass, the trees, birds, insects, everything in nature. I exulted in the mere fact of existence, of being a part of it all, the drizzling rain, the shadows of the clouds, the tree trunks, and so on. In the years following, such moments continued to come, but I wanted them constantly. I knew so well the satisfaction of losing self in a perception of supreme power and love, that I was unhappy because that perception was not constant. The cases quoted in my third lecture, pages, are still better ones of this type. In her essay, The Loss of Personality, in the Atlantic Monthly, Volume 85. Page 195, Miss Ethel D. Puffer explains that the vanishing of the sense of self, and the feeling of immediate unity with the object, is due to the disappearance, in these rapturous experiences, of the motor adjustments which habitually intermediate between the constant background of consciousness, which is the self, and the object in the foreground, whatever it may be. I must refer the reader to the highly instructive article, which seems to me to throw light upon the psychological conditions, though it fails to account for the rapture or the revelation value of the experience in the subject's eyes. Op. Cit. I. 43-44. Memoiren einer Idealistin, 5 te. Offlage, 1900, 3. 166. For years she had been unable to pray, owing to materialistic belief. Whitman in another place expresses in a quieter way what was probably with him a chronic mystical perception. There is, he writes, apart from mere intellect, in the make-up of every superior human identity, a wondrous something that realizes without argument, frequently without what is called education, though I think it the goal and apex of all education, deserving the name, an intuition of the absolute balance, in time and space, of the whole of this multifariousness, this revel of fools, an incredible make-believe and general unsettledness, we call the world, a sole sight of that divine clue and unseen thread which holds the whole congeries of things, all history and time, and all events, however trivial, however momentous, like a leashed dog in the hand of the hunter. Of such soul sight and root center for the mind, mere optimism explains only the surface. Whitman charges it against Carlyle that he lacked this perception. Specimen Days and Collect, Philadelphia, 1882, p. 174. My Quest for God, London, 1897, pp. 268, 269, abridged. Op. Cit., pages 256, 257, abridged. Cosmic Consciousness, A Study in the Evolution of the Human Mind, Philadelphia, 1901, page 2. Locke, Cit., pages 7, 8. My quotation follows the privately printed pamphlet which preceded Dr. Buck's larger work, and differs verbally a little from the text of the latter. My quotations are from Vivekananda, Raja Yoga. London, 1896. The completest source of information on yoga is the work translated by Vihari Lala Mitra, Yoga Vasishta Maharamayana, 4 volumes, Calcutta, 1891-99. A European witness, after carefully comparing the results of yoga with those of the hypnotic or dreamy states artificially producible by us, says, it makes of its true disciples good, healthy, and happy men. Through the mastery which the yogi attains over his thoughts and his body, he grows into a character. By the subjection of his impulses and propensities to his will, and the fixing of the latter upon the ideal of goodness, he becomes a personality hard to influence by others, and thus almost the opposite of what we usually imagine a medium, so-called, or psychic subject, to be. Karl Kellner, Yoga, ein Skiz, München, 1896, p. 21. I follow the account in C.F. Koppen, Die Religion der Buddha, Berlin, 1857, I. 585 ff. For a full account of him, c. D. B. MacDonald, The Life of Al-Ghazali, in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, 1899, Volume 20. Page 71. A. Schmolders, Essay sur les écoles philosophiques chez les Arabes, Paris, 1842, pages 54 to 68. Abridged. Gorza's Christlich. Mystic gives a full account of the facts. So does Ribot's Mystique Divine, 2 volumes, Paris, 1890. A still more methodical modern work is the Mystica Theologia of Valgornera, 2 volumes. Turin, 1890. M. Resijak, in a recent volume, makes them essential. Mysticism he defines as the tendency to draw near to the absolute morally, and by the aid of symbols. See his Fondements de la Connaissance Mystique, Paris, 1897, page 66. But there are unquestionably mystical conditions in which sensible symbols play no part. St. John of the Cross, The Dark Night of the Soul, Book 2. Ch. 17, in Vie et Oeuvre, 3 me. Edition, Paris, 1893, 3. 428 to 432, Chapter 11. Of Book 2. Of St. John's Ascent of Carmel is devoted to showing the harmfulness for the mystical life of the use of sensible imagery. In particular I omit mention of visual and auditory hallucinations, verbal and graphic automatisms, and such marvels as levitation, stigmatization, and the healing of disease. These phenomena, which mystics have often presented, or are believed to have presented, have no essential mystical significance, for they occur with no consciousness of illumination whatever, when they occur, as they often do, in persons of non-mystical mind. Consciousness of illumination is for us the essential mark of mystical states. The interior castle, fifth abode, ch. I, in Oeuvre, translated by Boix, 3. 421 to 424. Bartoli Michel, Vie de Saint Ignace de Loyola, I, 34 to 36. Others have had illuminations about the created world, Jacob Boehme, for instance. At the age of 25 he was surrounded by the divine light and replenished with the heavenly knowledge. Insomuch as going abroad into the fields to a green, at Gorlitz, he there sat down, and viewing the herbs and grass of the field, in his inward light he saw into their essences, use, and properties, which was discovered to him by their lineaments, figures, and signatures. Of a later period of experience he writes, "In 1/4 of an hour I saw and knew more than if I had been many years together at an university. For I saw and knew the being of all things, the byss and the abyss, and the eternal generation of the Holy Trinity, the descent and original of the world and of all creatures through the divine wisdom. I knew and saw in myself all the 3 worlds, the external and visible world being of a procreation or extern birth from both the internal and spiritual worlds. And I saw and knew the whole working essence, in the evil and in the good, and the mutual original and existence, and likewise how the fruitful bearing womb of eternity brought forth. So that I did not only greatly wonder at it, but did also exceedingly rejoice, albeit I could very hardly apprehend the same in my external man and set it down with the pen. For I had a thorough view of the universe as in a chaos, wherein all things are couched and wrapped up, but it was impossible for me to explicate the same." Jacob Boehme's Theosophic Philosophy, etc., by Edward Taylor, London. 1691, pp. 425, 427, abridged. So George Fox, I was come up to the state of Adam in which he was before he fell. The creation was open to me, and it was showed me, how all things had their names given to them, according to their nature and virtue. I was at a stand in my mind, whether I should practice physic for the good of mankind, seeing the nature and virtues of the creatures were so open to me by the Lord. Journal, Philadelphia, no date, page 69. Contemporary. Clairvoyance abounds in similar revelations. Andrew Jackson Davis's cosmogonies, for example, or certain experiences related in the delectable reminiscences and memories of Henry Thomas Butterworth, Lebanon, Ohio, 1886. Vi, pages 581, 582. Locke, Sit, page 574. Saint Teresa discriminates between pain in which the body has a part and pure spiritual pain, interior. Castle, Sixth Abode, ch. 11. As for the bodily part in these celestial joys, she speaks of it as penetrating to the marrow of the bones, whilst earthly pleasures affect only the surface of the senses. I think, she adds, that this is a just description, and I cannot make it better. Ibid, Fifth Abode, chi. Vi, page 198. Oeuvre, 2. 320. Above, p. Vi, pages 229, 200, 231 to 233, 243. Muller's translation, part 2, page 180. T. Davidson's translation. In Journal of Speculative Philosophy, 1893, volume 22. Page 399. Deus propter. Excellent I am non immerito nihil vocator. Scotus Origina. Quoted by Andrew Seth, 2 lectures. On Theism, New York, 1897, page 55. J. Royce, Studies in Good and Evil, page 282. Jacob Bayman's Dialogues on the Supersensual Life, translated by Bernard Holland, London, 1901, page 48. Cherubinischer Wandersman, Strophe 25. Op. Cit., pages 42, 74, abridged. From a French book I take this mystical expression of happiness in God's indwelling presence. Jesus has come to take up his abode in my heart. It is not so much a habitation, an association, as a sort of fusion. Oh, new and blessed life! Life which becomes each day more luminous. The wall before me, dark a few moments since, is splendid at this hour because the sun shines on it. Wherever its rays fall they light up a conflagration of glory. The smallest speck of glass sparkles, each grain of sand emits fire, even so there is a royal song of triumph in my heart because the Lord is there. My days succeed each other, yesterday a blue sky, today a clouded sun. A night filled with strange dreams, but as soon as the eyes open, and I regain consciousness and seem to begin life again, it is always the same figure before me, always the same presence filling my heart. Formerly the day was dulled by the absence of the Lord. I used to wake invaded by all sorts of sad impressions, and I did not find him on my path. Today he is with me. And the light cloudiness which covers things is not an obstacle to my communion with him. I feel the pressure of his hand, I feel something else which fills me with a serene joy. Shall I dare to speak it out? Yes, for it is the true expression of what I experience. The Holy Spirit is not merely making me a visit, it is no mere dazzling apparition which may from one moment to another spread its wings and leave me in my night, it is a permanent habitation. He can depart only if he takes me with him. More than that, he is not other than myself, he is one with me. It is not a juxtaposition, it is a penetration, a profound modification of my nature, a new manner of my being. Quoted from the MS. Of an Old Man, by Wilfred Monod, Il Vit, 6 Meditations sur le mystère chrétien, pages 280 to 283. Compare M. Maeterlinck, L'ornement de noces spirituelles de Rosebroek, Bruxelles, 1891, Introduction, page 19. Upanishads, M. Muller's translation, 2. 17, 334. Schmolders, Op. Cit. p. 210. Enneads, Bruyère's translation. Paris, 1861, 3. 561, compare pages 473 to 477, and Volume 1, page 27. Autobiography, pages 309, 310. Op. Cit., Strophe 10. H. P. Blavatsky, The Voice of the Silence. Swinburne, On the Verge. In A Midsummer Vacation. Compare the extracts from Dr. Buck. Quoted on pages. As serious an attempt as I know to mediate between the mystical region and the discursive life is contained in an article on Aristotle's Unmoved Mover, by F. C. S. Schiller, in Mind, Volume 9, 1900. I abstract from weaker states, and from those cases of which the books are full, where the director, but usually not the subject, remains in doubt whether the experience may not have proceeded from the demon. Example, Mr. John Nelson writes of his imprisonment for preaching Methodism. My soul was as a watered garden, and I could sing praises to God all day long. For he turned my captivity into joy, and gave me to rest, as well on the boards, as if I had been on a bed of down. Now could I say, God's service is perfect freedom, and I was carried out much in prayer that my enemies might drink of the same river of peace which my God gave so largely to me. Journal, London, no date, page 172. Rosebroek, in the work which Maeterlinck has translated, has a chapter against the antinomianism of disciples. H. Delacroix's book, Essai sur le mysticisme spéculatif en Allemagne au XIVe siècle, Paris. 1900, is full of antinomian material. Compare also A. Yunt, Les Aimes de Dieu au XIVe siècle, These de Strasbourg, 1879. Compare Paul Rouslot, Les Mystiques Espagnols, Paris, 1869, ch. 12. See Carpenter's Towards Democracy, especially the latter parts, and Jeffries's wonderful and splendid mystic rhapsody, The Story of My Heart. In Chapter 1, of Book 2. Of his work Degeneration, Max Nordau seeks to undermine all mysticism by exposing the weakness of the lower kinds. Mysticism for him means any sudden perception of hidden significance in things. He explains such perception by the abundant uncompleted associations which experiences may arouse in a degenerate brain. These give to him who has the experience a vague and vast sense of its leading further. Yet they awaken no definite or useful consequent in his thought. The explanation is a plausible one for certain sorts of feeling of significance. And other alienists, Wernicke, for example, in his Grundrisse der Psychiatrie, Thiel II, Leipzig, 1896, have explained paranoiac conditions by a laming of the association organ. But the higher mystical flights, with their positiveness and abruptness, are surely products of no such merely negative condition. It seems far more reasonable to ascribe them to inroads from the subconscious life, of the cerebral activity correlative to which we as yet know nothing. They sometimes add subjective audita et visa to the facts, but as these are usually interpreted as transmundane, they oblige no alteration in the facts of sense. Compare Professor W. Wallace's Gifford Lectures, in Lectures and Essays. Oxford, 1898, pages 17 ff. Op. Cit., page 174, abridged. Ibid, page 186, abridged and italicized. Discourse 2. Section 7. As regards the secondary character of intellectual constructions, and the primacy of feeling and instinct. In founding religious beliefs, see the striking work of H. Fielding, The Hearts of Men, London, 1902, which came into my hands after my text was written. Creeds, says the author, are the grammar of religion, they are to religion what grammar is to speech. Words are the expression of our wants. Grammar is the theory formed afterwards. Speech never proceeded from grammar, but the reverse. As speech progresses and changes from unknown causes, grammar must follow, page 313. The whole book, which keeps unusually close to concrete facts, is little more than an amplification of this text. For convenience sake, I follow the order of A. Stockel's Lehrbuchter. Philosophy, 5 Te Offlage, Mainz, 1881, Band 2. B. Better's Natural Theology, London, 1891, is a handy English Catholic manual, but an almost identical doctrine is given by such Protestant theologians as C. Hodge, Systematic Theology, New York, 1873, or A. H. Strong, Systematic Theology, 5th edition, New York, 1896. It must not be forgotten that any form of disorder in the world might, by the design argument, suggest a God for just that kind of disorder. The truth is that any state of things whatever that can be named is logically susceptible of teleological interpretation. The ruins of the earthquake at Lisbon, for example, the whole of past history had to be planned exactly as it was to bring about in the fullness of time just that particular arrangement of debris of masonry, furniture, and once living bodies. No other train of causes would have been sufficient. And so of any other arrangement, bad or good, which might as a matter of fact be found resulting anywhere from previous conditions. To avoid such pessimistic consequences and save its beneficent designer, the design argument accordingly invokes two other principles, restrictive in their operation. The first is physical. Nature's forces tend of their own accord only to disorder and destruction, to heaps of ruins, not to architecture. This principle, though plausible at first sight, seems, in the light of recent biology, to be more and more improbable. The second principle is one of anthropomorphic interpretation. No arrangement that for us is disorderly can possibly have been an object of design at all. This principle is of course a mere assumption in the interests of anthropomorphic theism. When one views the world with no definite theological bias one way or the other, one sees that order and disorder, as we now recognize them, are purely human inventions. We are interested in certain types of arrangement, useful, aesthetic, or moral, so interested that whenever we find them realized, the fact emphatically rivets our attention. The result is that we work over the contents of the world selectively. It is overflowing with disorderly arrangements from our point of view, but order is the only thing we care for and look at, and by choosing, one can always find some sort of orderly arrangement in the midst of any chaos. If I should throw down 1,000 beans at random upon a table, I could doubtless, by eliminating a sufficient number of them, leave the rest in almost any geometrical pattern you might propose to me. And you might then say that that pattern was the thing prefigured beforehand, and that the other beans were mere irrelevance and packing material. Our dealings with nature are just like this. She is a vast plenum in which our attention draws capricious lines in innumerable directions. We count and name whatever lies upon the special lines we trace, whilst the other things and the untraced lines are neither named nor counted. There are in reality infinitely more things unadapted to each other in this world than there are things adapted, infinitely more things with irregular relations than with regular relations between them. But we look for the regular kind of thing exclusively, and ingeniously discover and preserve it in our memory. It accumulates with other regular kinds, until the collection of them fills our encyclopedias. Yet all the while between and around them lies an infinite anonymous chaos of objects that no one ever thought of together, of relations that never yet attracted our attention. The facts of order from which the physico-theological argument starts are thus easily susceptible of interpretation as arbitrary human products. So long as this is the case, although of course no argument against God follows, it follows that the argument for him will fail to constitute a knockdown proof of his existence. It will be convincing only to those who on other grounds believe in him already. For the scholastics the facultas appetendi embraces feeling, desire, and will. Op. Cit., Discourse 3. Section 7. In an article, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, in the Popular Science Monthly for January, 1878, Volume 12. Page 286. Pragmatically, the most important attribute of God is his punitive justice. But who, in the present state of theological opinion on that point, will dare maintain that hell-fire or its equivalent in some shape is rendered certain by pure logic? Theology herself has largely based this doctrine upon revelation, and, in discussing it, has tended more and more to substitute conventional ideas of criminal law for a priori principles of reason. But the very notion that this glorious universe, with planets and winds, and laughing sky and ocean, should have been conceived and had its beams and rafters laid in technicalities of criminality, is incredible to our modern imagination. It weakens a religion to hear it argued upon such a basis. John Caird, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion, London and New York, 1880, pages 243 to 250, and 291 to 299, much abridged. A. C. Fraser, Philosophy of Theism, 2nd edition, Edinburgh and London, 1899, especially Part 2. Chaps. 7 and 8, Seth, Pringle Pattison, Hegelianism and Personality, Ibid, 1890, Passim. The most persuasive arguments in favor of a concrete individual soul of the world, with which I am acquainted, are those of my colleague, Josiah Royce, in his Religious Aspect of Philosophy, Boston, 1885. In his Conception of God, New York and London, 1897, and lately in his Aberdeen Gifford Lectures, The World and the Individual, 2 volumes, New York and London, 1901 to 2002. I doubtless seem to some of my readers to evade the philosophic duty which my thesis in this lecture imposes on me, by not even attempting to meet Professor Royce's arguments articulately. I admit the momentary evasion. In the present lectures, which are cast throughout in a popular mold, there seemed no room for subtle metaphysical discussion, and for tactical purposes it was sufficient, the contention of philosophy being what it is, namely, that religion can be transformed into a universally convincing science, to point to the fact that no religious philosophy has actually convinced the mass of thinkers. Meanwhile let me say that I hope that the present volume may be followed by another, if I am spared to write it, in which not only Professor Royce's arguments, but others for monistic absolutism shall be considered with all the technical fullness which their great importance calls for. At present I resign myself to lying passive under the reproach of superficiality. Idea of a University, Discourse 3. 7. Newman's imagination so innately craved an ecclesiastical system that he can write, from the age of 15, dogma has been the fundamental principle of my religion, I know no other religion. I cannot enter into the idea of any other sort of religion. And again, speaking of himself about the age of 30, he writes, I love to act as feeling myself in my bishop's sight, as if it were the sight of God. Apologia. 1897, pages 48, 50. The intellectual difference is quite on a par in practical importance with the analogous difference in character. We saw, under the head of saintliness, how some characters resent confusion and must live in purity, consistency, Simplicity, above, p. ff. For others, on the contrary, superabundance, overpressure. Stimulation, lots of superficial relations, are indispensable. There are men who would suffer a very syncope if you should pay all their debts, bring it about that their engagements had been kept, their letters answered, their perplexities relieved, and their duties fulfilled, down to one which lay on a clean table under their eyes with nothing to interfere with its immediate performance. A day stripped so staringly bare would be for them appalling. So with ease, elegance, tributes of affection, social recognitions, some of us require amounts of these things which to others would appear a mass of lying and sophistication. In Newman's Lectures on Justification, Lecture 8, Section 6, there is a splendid passage expressive of this aesthetic way of feeling the Christian scheme. It is unfortunately too long to quote. Compare the informality of Protestantism, where the meek lover of the good, alone with his God, visits the sick, etc. For their own sakes, with the elaborate business that goes on in Catholic devotion, and carries with it the social excitement of all more complex businesses. An essentially worldly-minded Catholic woman can become a visitor of the sick on purely coquettish principles, with her confessor and director, her merit storing up, her patron saints, her privileged relation to the Almighty drawing his attention as a professional devote, her definite exercises, and her definitely recognized social pose in the organization. Above, p.ff. A fuller discussion of confession is contained in the excellent work by Frank Granger, The Soul of a Christian, London, 1900, ch. 12. Example, the minister at Sudbury, being at the Thursday lecture in Boston, heard the officiating clergyman praying for rain. As soon as the service was over, he went to the petitioner and said, "You Boston ministers, as soon as a tulip wilts under your windows, go to church and pray for rain, until all Concord and Sudbury are under water." R. W. Emerson, Lectures and Biographical Sketches, p. 363. Auguste Sabatier, Esquisse. D'une philosophie de la religion, Toomey ed., 1897, pages 24-26. Abridged. My authority for these statistics is The Little Work on Muller, by Frederick G. Warren, New York, 1898. The Life of Trust, being a narrative of the Lord's dealings with George Muller, New American Edition, N. Y. Crowell, pages 228, 194, 219. Ibid, page 126. Op. Cit., page 383, abridged. Ibid, page 323. I cannot resist the temptation of quoting an expression of an even more primitive style of religious thought, which I find in Arber's English Garland, Volume 7. Page 440. Robert Lyde, an English sailor, along with an English boy, being prisoners on a French ship in 1689, set upon the crew of 7 Frenchmen, killed 2, made the other 5 prisoners, and brought home the ship. Lyde thus describes how in this feat he found his God a very present help in time of trouble. With the assistance of God I kept my feet when they 3 and 1 more did strive to throw me down. Feeling the Frenchman which hung about my middle hang very heavy, I said to the boy, "Go round the binnacle, and knock down that man that hangeth on my back." So the boy did strike him 1 blow on the head which made him fall. Then I looked about for a marline spike or anything else to strike them withal. But seeing nothing, I said, "Lord, what shall I do?" Then casting up my eye upon my left side, and seeing a marline spike hanging, I jerked my right arm and took hold, and struck the point 4 times about 1/4 of an inch deep into the skull of that man that had hold of my left arm. One of the Frenchmen then hauled the marlin spike away from him. But through God's wonderful providence, it either fell out of his hand, or else he threw it down, and at this time the Almighty God gave me strength enough to take one man in one hand, and throw at the other's head, and looking about again to see anything to strike them withal. But seeing nothing, I said, Lord, what shall I do now? And then it pleased God to put me in mind of my knife in my pocket. And although two of the men had hold of my right arm, yet God Almighty strengthened me so that I put my right hand into my right pocket, drew out the knife and sheath, put it between my legs and drew it out, and then cut the man's throat with it that had his back to my breast, and he immediately dropped down, and scarce ever stirred after. I have slightly abridged Lyde's narrative. As, for instance, in answer to prayer, by the Bishop of Ripon and others, London, 1898, touching incidents and remarkable answers to prayer, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 1898. H. L. Hastings, The Guiding Hand, or Providential Direction, illustrated by authentic instances, Boston, 1898. C. Hilty, Gluck, Dritter. Thiel, 1900, pages 92 ff. Good heaven, says Epictetus, any one thing in the creation is sufficient to demonstrate a providence, to a humble and grateful mind. The mere possibility of producing milk from grass, cheese from milk, and wool from skins, who formed and planned it? Ought we not, whether we dig or plow or eat, to sing this hymn to God? Great is God, who has supplied us with these instruments to till the ground, great is God, who has given us hands and instruments of digestion, who has given us to grow insensibly and to breathe in sleep. These things we ought forever to celebrate. But because the most of you are blind and insensible, there must be some one to fill this station, and lead, in behalf of all men, the hymn to God. For what else can I do, a lame old man, but sing hymns to God? Were I a nightingale, I would act the part of a nightingale, were I a swan, the part of a swan. But since I am a reasonable creature, it is my duty to praise God. And I call on you to join the same song. Works, Book I. Ch. 16. Carter Higginson. Translation, abridged. James Martineau, end of. The Sermon, Help Thou Mine. Unbelief, in Endeavors After a Christian Life, 2D Series. Compare with this page the extract from Voici on p. 275, above. And those from Pascal and Madame Guyon on page 286. Souvenirs de ma jeunesse, 1897, p. 122. Op. Cit., letter XXX. Above, p. ff. Compare the withdrawal of expression from The World, in Melancholiacs, page 151. Above, pages. A friend of mine, a first-rate psychologist who is a subject of graphic automatism, tells me that the appearance of independent actuation in the movements of his arm, when he writes automatically, is so distinct that it obliges him to abandon a psychophysical theory which he had previously believed in, the theory, namely, that we have no feeling of the discharge downwards of our voluntary motor centers. We must normally have such a feeling, he thinks, or the sense of an absence would not be so striking as it is in these experiences. Graphic automatism of a fully developed kind is rare in religious history, so far as my knowledge goes. Such statements as Antonia Bourignin's, that I do nothing but lend my hand and spirit to another power than mine, is shown by the context to indicate inspiration rather than directly automatic writing. In some eccentric sects this latter occurs. The most striking instance of it is probably the bulky volume called OSP, A New Bible in the Words of Jehovah and His Angel. Ambassadors, Boston and London, 1891, written and illustrated. Automatically by Dr. Newbrough of New York. Whom I understand to be now, or to have been lately, at the head of the Spiritistic community of Shalom in New Mexico. The latest automatically written book which has come under my notice is Zertulum's Wisdom of the Ages, by George A. Fuller, Boston. 1901. W. Sandy, The Oracles of God, London, 1892, pages 49 to 56, abridged. Op. Cit., page 91. This author also cites Moses's and Isaiah's commissions, as given in Exodus, chaps 3 and 4, and Isaiah, chapter 6. Quoted by Augustus Clissold, The Prophetic Spirit in Genius and Madness. 1870, page 67. Mr. Clissold is a Swedenborgian. Swedenborg's case is, of course, the palmary one of Audita et Visa, serving as a basis of religious revelation. Noldiek, Geschichte de Korans, 1860, page 16. Compare the fuller account in Sir William Muir's Life of Muhammad, 3d edition, 1894, ch. 3. The Mormon theocracy has always been governed by direct revelations accorded to the President of the Church and its apostles. From an obliging letter written to me in 1899 by an eminent Mormon, I quote the following extract. It may be very interesting for you to know that the President, Mr. Snow, of the Mormon Church claims to have had a number of revelations very recently from heaven. To explain fully what these revelations are, it is necessary to know that we, as a people, believe that the Church of Jesus Christ has again been established through messengers sent from heaven. This Church has at its head a prophet, seer, and revelator, who gives to man God's holy will. Revelation is the means through which the will of God is declared directly and in fullness to man. These revelations are got through dreams of sleep or in waking visions of the mind, by voices without visional appearance, or by actual manifestations of the Holy Presence before the eye. We believe that God has come in person and spoken to our prophet and revelator. For example, on pages above. From this point of view, the contrasts between the healthy and the morbid mind, and between the once-born and the twice-born types, of which I spoke in earlier lectures, see pages, cease to be. The radical antagonisms which many think them. The twice-born look down upon the rectilinear consciousness of life of the once-born as being mere morality, and not properly religion. Dr. Channing, an Orthodox minister, is reported to have said, is excluded from the highest form of religious life by the extraordinary rectitude of his character. It is indeed true that the outlook upon life of the twice-born, holding as it does more of the element of evil in solution, is the wider and completer. The heroic or solemn way in which life comes to them is a higher synthesis into which healthy-mindedness and morbidness both enter and combine. Evil is not evaded, but sublated in the higher religious cheer of these persons, see pages. But the final consciousness which each type reaches of union with the divine has the same practical significance for the individual. And individuals may well be allowed to get to it by the channels which lie most open to their several temperaments. In the cases which were quoted in Lecture 4 of the mind-cure form of healthy-mindedness, we found abundant examples of regenerative process. The severity of the crisis in this process is a matter of degree. How long one shall continue to drink the consciousness of evil, and when one shall begin to short-circuit and get rid of it, are also matters of amount and degree. So that in many instances it is quite arbitrary whether we Class the individual as a once-born or a twice-born subject. Compare, e.g., the quotation from Renan on p. above. Prayerful, taken in the broader sense explained above on pages ff. How was it ever conceivable, we ask, that a man like Christian Wolff, in whose dry as dust head all the learning of the early 18th century was concentrated, should have preserved such a baby-like faith in the personal and human character of nature as to expound her operations as he did in his work on the uses of natural things? This, for example, is the account he gives of the sun and its utility. We see that God has created the sun to keep the changeable conditions on the earth in such an order that living creatures, men and beasts, may inhabit its surface. Since men are the most reasonable of creatures, and able to infer God's invisible being from the contemplation of the world, the sun in so far forth contributes to the primary purpose of creation. Without it the race of man could not be preserved or continued. The sun makes daylight, not only on our earth, but also on the other planets, and daylight is of the utmost utility to us. For by its means we can commodiously carry on those occupations which in the night time would either be quite impossible, or at any rate impossible without our going to the expense of artificial light. The beasts of the field can find food by day which they would not be able to find at night. Moreover, we owe it to the sunlight that we are able to see everything that is on the earth's surface, not only nearby, but also at a distance, and to recognize both near and far things according to their species. Which again is of manifold use to us not only in the business necessary to human life, and when we are traveling, but also for the scientific knowledge of nature, which knowledge for the most part depends on observations made with the help of sight. And, without the sunshine, would have been impossible. If any one would rightly impress on his mind the great advantages which he derives from the sun, let him imagine himself living through only 1 month, and see how it would be with all his undertakings, if it were not day but night. He would then be sufficiently convinced out of his own experience, especially if he had much work to carry on in the street or in the fields. From the sun we learn to recognize when it is midday, and by knowing this point of time exactly, we can set our clocks right, on which account astronomy owes much to the sun. By help of the sun one can find the meridian. But the meridian is the basis of our sundials, and generally speaking, we should have no sundials if we had no sun. Vernunftige gedenken von den Absichten der Nederlichen Dinge, 1782, pages 74-84. Or read the account of God's beneficence in the institution of the great variety throughout the world of men's faces, voices, and handwriting, given in Derham's Physicotheology, a book that had much vogue in the 18th century. Had man's body, says Derham, been made according to any of the atheistical schemes, or any other method than that of the infinite Lord of the world, this wise variety would never have been, but men's faces would have been cast in the same, or not a very different mold, their organs of speech would have sounded the same or not so great a variety of notes. And the same structure of muscles and nerves would have given the hand the same direction in writing. And in this case, what confusion, what disturbance, what mischiefs would the world eternally have lain under? No security could have been to our persons, no certainty, no enjoyment of our possessions, no justice between man and man, no distinction between good and bad, between friends and foes, between father and child, husband and wife, male or female. But all would have been turned topsy-turvy, by being exposed to the malice of the envious and ill-natured, to the fraud and violence of knaves and robbers, to the forgeries of the crafty cheat, to the lusts of the effeminate and debauched. And what not? Our courts of justice can abundantly testify the dire effects of mistaking men's faces, of counterfeiting their hands, and forging writings. But now as the infinitely wise Creator and Ruler hath ordered the matter, every man's face can distinguish him in the light, and his voice in the dark. His handwriting can speak for him though absent, and be his witness, and secure his contracts in future generations. A manifest as well as admirable indication of the divine superintendence and management. A God so careful as to make provision even for the unmistakable signing of bank checks and deeds was a deity truly after the heart of 18th century Anglicanism. I subjoin, omitting the capitals, Derham's Vindication of God by the Institution of Hills and Valleys, and Wolfe's altogether culinary account of the institution of water. The uses, says Wolfe, which water serves in human life are plain to see and need not be described at length. Water is a universal drink of man and beasts. Even though men have made themselves drinks that are artificial, they could not do this without water. Beer is brewed of water and malt, and it is the water in it which quenches thirst. Wine is prepared from grapes, which could never have grown without the help of water, and the same is true of those drinks which in England and other places they produce from fruit. Therefore, since God so planned the world that men and beasts should live upon it and find there everything required for their necessity and convenience, he also made water as one means whereby to make the earth into so excellent a dwelling. And this is all the more manifest when we consider the advantages which we obtain from this same water for the cleaning of our household utensils, of our clothing, and of other matters. When one goes into a grinding mill one sees that the grindstone must always be kept wet, and then one will get a still greater idea of the use of water. Of the hills and valleys, Derham, after praising their beauty, discourses as follows: some constitutions are indeed of so happy a strength, and so confirmed in health, as to be indifferent to almost any place or temperature of the air. But then others are so weakly and feeble, as not to be able to bear one, but can live comfortably in another place. With some the more subtle and finer air of the hills doth best agree, who are languishing and dying in the feculent and grosser air of great towns, or even the warmer and vaporous air of the valleys and waters. But contrariwise, others languish on the hills, and grow lusty and strong in the warmer air of the valleys. So that this opportunity of shifting our abode from the hills to the valleys, is an admirable easement, refreshment, and great benefit to the valetudinarian, feeble part of mankind. Affording those an easy and comfortable life, who would otherwise live miserably, languish, and pine away. To this salutary conformation of the earth we may add another great convenience of the hills, and that is affording commodious places for habitation. Serving, as an eminent author wordeth it, as screens to keep off the cold and nipping blasts of the northern and easterly winds, and reflecting the benign and cherishing sunbeams. And so rendering our habitations both more comfortable and more cheerly in winter. Lastly, it is to the hills that the fountains owe their rise and the rivers their conveyance, and consequently those vast masses and lofty piles are not, as they are charged, such rude and useless excrescences of our ill-formed globe, but the admirable tools of nature, contrived and ordered by the infinite Creator, to do one of its most useful works. For, was the surface of the earth even and level, and the middle parts of its islands and continents not mountainous and high as now it is most certain there could be no descent for the rivers, no conveyance for the waters. But, instead of gliding along those gentle declivities which the higher lands now afford them quite down to the sea, they would stagnate and perhaps stink, and also drown large tracts of land. Thus, the hills and valleys, though to a peevish and weary traveller they may seem incommodious and troublesome, yet are a noble work of the great Creator, and wisely appointed by Him for the good of our sublunary world. Until the 17th century this mode of thought prevailed. One need only recall the dramatic treatment even of mechanical questions by Aristotle, as, for example, his explanation of the power of the lever to make a small weight raise a larger one. This is due, according to Aristotle, to the generally miraculous character of the circle and of all circular movement. The circle is both convex and concave, it is made by a fixed point and a moving line, which contradict each other. And whatever moves in a circle moves in opposite directions. Nevertheless, movement in a circle is the most natural movement. And the long arm of the lever, moving, as it does, in the larger circle, has the greater amount of this natural motion, and consequently requires the lesser force. Or recall the explanation by Herodotus of the position of the sun in winter: it moves to the south because of the cold which drives it into the warm parts of the heavens over Libya. Or listen to St. Augustine's speculations, who gave to chaff such power to freeze that it preserves snow buried under it, and such power to warm that it ripens green fruit. Who can explain the strange properties of fire itself, which blackens all that it burns, though itself bright, and which, though of the most beautiful colors, discolors almost all that it touches and feeds upon, and turns blazing fuel into grimy cinders. Then what wonderful properties do we find in charcoal, which is so brittle that a light tap breaks it, and a slight pressure pulverizes it, and yet is so strong that no moisture rots it, nor any time causes it to decay. City of God, Book 21. Ch. 4. Such aspects of things as these, their naturalness and unnaturalness, the sympathies and antipathies of their superficial qualities, their eccentricities, their brightness and strength and destructiveness, were inevitably the ways in which they originally fastened our attention. If you open early medical books, you will find sympathetic magic invoked on every page. Take, for example, the famous vulnerary ointment attributed to Paracelsus. For this there were a variety of receipts, including usually human fat, the fat of either a bull, a wild boar, or a bear. Powdered earthworms, the usnea, or mossy growth on the weathered skull of a hanged criminal, and other materials equally unpleasant, the whole prepared under the planet Venus if possible, but never under Mars or Saturn. Then, if a splinter of wood, dipped in the patient's blood, or the blood-stained weapon that wounded him, be immersed in this ointment, the wound itself being tightly bound up, the latter infallibly gets well. I quote now Van Helmont's account. For the blood on the weapon or splinter, containing in it the spirit of the wounded man, is roused to active excitement by the contact of the ointment, whence there results to it a full commission or power to cure its cousin german, the blood in the patient's body. This it does by sucking out the dolorous and exotic impression from the wounded part. But to do this it has to implore the aid of the bull's fat, and other portions of the unguent. The reason why bull's fat is so powerful is that the bull at the time of slaughter is full of secret reluctancy and vindictive murmurs, and therefore dies with a higher flame of revenge about him than any other animal. And thus we have made it out, says this author, that the admirable efficacy of the ointment ought to be imputed, not to any auxiliary concurrence of Satan, but simply to the energy of the posthumous character of revenge remaining firmly impressed upon the blood and concreted fat in the unguent. J. B. Van Helmont, A Ternary of Paradoxes, translated by Walter Charlton, London, 1650. I much abridge the original in my citations. The author goes on to prove by the analogy of many other natural facts that this sympathetic action between things at a distance is the true rationale of the case. If, he says, the heart of a horse, slain by a witch, taken out of the yet reeking carcass, be impaled upon an arrow and roasted, immediately the whole which becomes tormented with the insufferable pains and cruelty of the fire, which could by no means happen unless there preceded a conjunction of the spirit of the witch with the spirit of the horse. In the reeking and yet panting heart, the spirit of the witch is kept captive, and the retreat of it prevented by the arrow transfixed. Similarly hath not many a murdered carcass at the coroner's inquest suffered a fresh hemorrhage or cruentation at the presence of the assassin. The blood being, as in a furious fit of anger, enraged and agitated by the impress of revenge conceived against the murderer, at the instant of the soul's compulsive exile from the body. So, if you have dropsy, gout, or jaundice, by including some of your warm blood in the shell and white of an egg, which, exposed to a gentle heat, and mixed with a bait of flesh, you shall give to a hungry dog or hog, the disease shall instantly pass from you into the animal, and leave you entirely. And similarly again, if you burn some of the milk either of a cow or of a woman, the gland from which it issued will dry up. A gentleman at Brussels had his nose mowed off in a combat, but the celebrated surgeon Tagliacozzus digged a new nose for him out of the skin of the arm of a porter at Bologna. About 13 months after his return to his own country, the engrafted nose grew cold, putrefied, and in a few days dropped off, and it was then discovered that the porter had expired, near about the same punctilio of time. There are still at Brussels eyewitnesses of this occurrence, says Van Helmont, and adds, I pray what is there in this of superstition or of exalted imagination? Modern mind-cure literature, the works of Prentice Mulford, for example, is full of sympathetic magic. Compare Lotze's doctrine that the only meaning we can attach to the notion of a thing as it is In itself is by conceiving it as. It is for itself, i.e. as a piece of full experience with a private sense of pinch or inner activity of some sort going with it. Even the errors of fact may possibly turn out not to be as wholesale as the scientist assumes. We saw in lecture for how the religious conception of the universe seems to many mind-curers verified from day to day by their experience of fact. Experience of fact is a field with so many things in it that the sectarian scientist, methodically declining, as he does, to recognize such facts as mind-curers and others like them experience. Otherwise than by such rude heads of classification as bosh, rot, folly, certainly leaves out a mass of raw fact which, save for the industrious interest of the religious in the more personal aspects of reality, would never have succeeded in getting itself recorded at all. We know this to be true already in certain cases, it may, therefore, be true in others as well. Miraculous healings have always been part of the supernaturalist stock in trade, and have always been dismissed by the scientist as figments of the imagination. But the scientist's tardy education in the facts of hypnotism has recently given him an apperceiving mass for phenomena of this order, and he consequently now allows that the healings may exist, provided you expressly call them effects of suggestion. Even the stigmata of the cross on St. Francis's hands and feet may on these terms not be a fable. Similarly, the time-honored phenomenon of diabolical possession is on the point of being admitted by the scientist as a fact, now that he has the name of hysterodemonopathy, by which to apperceive it. No one can foresee just how far this legitimation of occultist phenomena under newly found scientist titles may proceed, even prophecy, even levitation, might creep into the pale. Thus the divorce between scientist facts and religious facts may not necessarily be as eternal as it at first sight seems, nor the personalism and romanticism of the world, as they appeared to primitive thinking, be matters so irrevocably outgrown. The final human opinion may, in short, in some manner now impossible to foresee, revert to the more personal style, just as any path of progress may follow a spiral rather than a straight line. If this were so, the rigorously impersonal view of science might one day appear as having been a temporarily useful eccentricity rather than the definitively triumphant position which the sectarian scientist at present so confidently announces it to be. Hume's criticism has banished causation from the world of physical objects, and science is absolutely satisfied to define cause in terms of concomitant change. Read Mach, Pearson, Ostwald. The original of the notion of causation is in our interpersonal experience, and only there can causes in the old-fashioned sense be directly observed and described. When I read in a religious paper words like these, perhaps the best thing we can say of God is that he is the inevitable inference, I recognize the tendency to let religion evaporate in intellectual terms. Would martyrs have sung in the flames for a mere inference, however inevitable it might be? Original religious men, like St. Francis, Luther, Bayman, have usually been enemies of the intellect's pretension to meddle with religious things. Yet the intellect, everywhere invasive, shows everywhere its shallowing effect. See how the ancient spirit of Methodism evaporates under those wonderfully able rationalistic booklets, which every one should read, of a philosopher like Professor Bown, The Christian Revelation, The Christian Life. The Atonement, Cincinnati in New York, 1898, 1899, 1900. See the positively expulsive purpose of philosophy properly so called. Religion, writes M. Vacherat, La Religion, Paris, 1869, pp. 313, 436, E. Passim, answers to a transient state or condition, not to a permanent determination of human nature, being merely an expression of that stage of the human mind which is dominated by the imagination. Christianity has but a single possible final heir to its estate, and that is scientific philosophy. In a still more radical vein, Professor Ribot, Psychologie des Sentiments, page 310, describes the evaporation of religion. He sums it up in a single formula: the ever-growing predominance of the rational intellectual element, with the gradual fading out of the emotional element, this latter tending to enter into the group of purely intellectual sentiments. Of religious sentiment properly so called, nothing survives at last save a vague respect for the unknowable X, which is a last relic of the fear, and a certain attraction towards the ideal, which is a relic of the love that characterized the earlier periods of religious growth. To state this more simply, religion tends to turn into religious philosophy. These are psychologically entirely different things, the one being a theoretic construction of ratiocination, whereas the other is the living work of a group of persons, or of a great inspired leader, calling into play the entire thinking and feeling organism of man. I find the same failure to recognize that the stronghold of religion lies in individuality in attempts like those of Professor Baldwin, Mental Development, Social and Ethical Interpretations, CHX. And Mr. H. R. Marshall, Instinct and Reason, Chaps. 8-12. To make it a purely conservative social force. Compare, for instance, pages 256 to 278. American Journal of Psychology, 7. 345. Above, p. Above, p. Above, p. Example, Henri Parive writes to Graytree, I do not know how to deal with the happiness which you aroused in me this morning. It overwhelms me, I want to do something, yet I can do nothing and am fit for nothing. I would fain do great things. Again, after an inspiring interview, he writes, I went homewards, intoxicated with joy, hope, and strength. I wanted to feed upon my happiness in solitude, far from all men. It was late. But, unheeding that, I took a mountain path and went on like a madman, looking at the heavens, regardless of earth. Suddenly an instinct made me draw hastily back, I was on the very edge of a precipice, one step more and I must have fallen. I took fright and gave up my nocturnal promenade. A. Graytree, Henri Parive, London, 1872, pages 92-89. This primacy, in the faith state, of vague expansive impulse over direction is well expressed in Walt Whitman's lines, Leaves of Grass, 1872, p. 190. Oh, to confront night, storms, hunger, ridicule, accidents, rebuffs, as the trees and animals do. Dear camarado, I confess I have urged you onward with me, and still urge you, without the least idea what is our destination. Or whether we shall be victorious, or utterly quelled and defeated. This readiness for great things, and this sense that the world by its importance, wonderfulness, etc., is apt for their production, would seem to be the undifferentiated germ of all the higher faiths. Trust in our own dreams of ambition, or in our country's expansive destinies, and faith in the providence of God, all have their source in that onrush of our sanguine impulses, and in that sense of the exceedingness of the possible over the real. Compare Lubbe, Locke, Sit, pp. 346-349. The contents of religious consciousness, in the Monist, 11. 536, July, 1901. Locke, Sit, pages 571, 572, abridged. See, also, this writer's extraordinarily true criticism of the notion that religion primarily seeks to solve the intellectual mystery of the world. Compare what W. Bender says, in his Wesen der Religion, Bonn, 1888. pp. 85, 38, not the question about God. And not the inquiry into the origin and purpose of the world is religion, but the question about man. All religious views of life are anthropocentric. Religion is that activity of the human impulse towards self-preservation by means of which man seeks to carry his essential vital purposes through against the adverse pressure of the world by raising himself freely towards the world's ordering and governing powers when the limits of his own strength are reached. The whole book is little more than a development of these words. Remember that for some men it arrives suddenly, for others gradually, whilst others again practically enjoy it all their life. The practical difficulties are, 1, to realize the reality of one's higher part, 2, to identify one's self with it exclusively, and 3, to identify it with all the rest of ideal being. When mystical activity is at its height, we find consciousness possessed by the sense of a being at once excessive and identical with the self, great enough to be God, interior enough to be me. The objectivity of it ought in that case to be called excessivity, rather, or exceedingness. Ressajac, Essai sur les Fondements de la Conscience Mystique, 1897, page 46. The word truth is here taken to mean something additional to bear value for life, although the natural propensity of man is to believe that whatever has great value for life is thereby certified as true. Above, p. Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, Volume 7. Page 305. For a full statement of Mr. Myers's views, I may refer to his posthumous work, Human Personality in the Light of Recent Research, which is already announced by Messrs. Longmans, Green and Company as being in press. Mr. Myers for the first time proposed as a general psychological problem the exploration of the subliminal region of consciousness throughout its whole extent, and made the first methodical steps in its topography by treating as a natural series a mass of subliminal facts hitherto considered only as curious isolated facts, and subjecting them to a systematized nomenclature. How important this exploration will prove, future work upon the path which Myers has opened can alone show. Compare my paper, Frederick Myers's Services to Psychology, in the said Proceedings, Part 42, May 1901. Compare the inventory given above on pages. And also what is said of the subconscious self on pages. Compare above, pages ff. One more expression of this belief, to increase the reader's familiarity with the notion of it. If this room is full of darkness for thousands of years, and you come in and begin to weep and wail, oh, the darkness, will the darkness vanish? Bring the light in, strike a match, and light comes in a moment. So what good will it do you to think all your lives, oh, I have done evil, I have made many mistakes? It requires no ghost to tell us that. Bring in the light, and the evil goes in a moment. Strengthen the real nature, build up yourselves, the effulgent, the resplendent, the ever pure, call that up in every one whom you see. I wish that every one of us had come to such a state that even when we see the vilest of human beings we can see the God within, and instead of condemning, say, Rise, thou effulgent one, rise thou who art always pure. Rise thou birthless and deathless, rise almighty, and manifest your nature. This is the highest prayer that the Advaita teaches. This is the one prayer, remembering our nature. Why does man go out to look for a God? It is your own heart beating, and you did not know, you were mistaking it for something external. He, nearest of the near, my own self, the reality of my own life, my body and my soul. I am thee and thou art me. That is your own nature. Assert it, manifest it. Not to become pure, you are pure already. You are not to be perfect, you are that already. Every good thought which you think or act upon is simply tearing the veil, as it were, and the purity, the infinity, the God behind, manifests itself, the eternal subject of everything, the eternal witness in this universe, your own self. Knowledge is, as it were, a lower step, a degradation. We are it already, how to know it? Swami Vivekananda, Addresses, No. 12, Practical Vedanta, Part 4. Pages 172, 174, London, 1897, in Lectures, The Real and the Apparent Man, page 24, abridged. For instance, here is a case where a person exposed from her birth to Christian ideas had to wait till they came to her clad in spiritistic formulas before the saving experience set in. For myself, I can say that spiritualism has saved me. It was revealed to me at a critical moment of my life, and without it I don't know what I should have done. It has taught me to detach myself from worldly things and to place my hope in things to come. Through it I have learned to see in all men, even in those most criminal, even in those from whom I have most suffered, undeveloped brothers to whom I owed assistance, love, and forgiveness. I have learned that I must lose my temper over nothing, despise no one, and pray for all. Most of all I have learned to pray. And although I have still much to learn in this domain, prayer ever brings me more strength, consolation, and comfort. I feel more than ever that I have only made a few steps on the long road of progress, but I look at its length without dismay, for I have confidence that the day will come when all my efforts shall be rewarded. So spiritualism has a great place in my life, indeed it holds the first place there. Flournoy Collection. The influence of the Holy Spirit, exquisitely called the Comforter, is a matter of actual experience, as solid a reality as that of electromagnetism. W. C. Brownell, Scribner's Magazine, Volume 30. Page 112. That the transaction of opening ourselves, otherwise called prayer, is a perfectly definite one for certain persons, appears abundantly in the preceding lectures. I append another concrete example to reinforce the impression on the reader's mind. Man can learn to transcend these limitations, of finite thought, and draw power and wisdom at will. The divine presence is known through experience. The turning to a higher plane is a distinct act of consciousness. It is not a vague, twilight or semi-conscious experience. It is not an ecstasy, it is not a trance. It is not superconsciousness in the Vedantic sense. It is not due to self-hypnotization. It is a perfectly calm, sane, sound, rational, common-sense shifting of consciousness from the phenomena of sense perception to the phenomena of seership, from the thought of self to a distinctively higher realm. For example, if the lower self be nervous, anxious, tense, one can in a few moments compel it to be calm. This is not done by a word simply. Again I say, it is not hypnotism. It is by the exercise of power. One feels the spirit of peace as definitely as heat is perceived on a hot summer day. The power can be as surely used as the sun's rays can be focused and made to do work, to set fire to wood. The Higher Law, Volume 4. pp. 4, 6, Boston, August, 1901. Transcendentalists are fond of the term oversoul, but as a rule they use it in an intellectualist sense, as meaning only a medium of communion. God is a causal agent, as well as a medium of communion, and that is the aspect which I wish to emphasize. Transcendental idealism, of course, insists that its ideal world makes this difference, that facts exist. We owe it to the absolute that we have a world of fact at all. A world of fact, that exactly is the trouble. An entire world is the smallest unit with which the absolute can work, whereas to our finite minds work for the better ought to be done within this world, setting in at single points. Our difficulties and our ideals are all piecemeal affairs, but the absolute can do no piecework for us, so that all the interests which our poor souls compass raise their heads too late. We should have spoken earlier, prayed for another world absolutely, before this world was born. It is strange, I have heard a friend say, to see this blind corner into which Christian thought has worked itself at last, with its God who can raise no particular weight whatever, who can help us with no private burden, and who is on the side of our enemies as much as he is on our own. Odd evolution from the God of David's Psalms. See My Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Philosophy, 1897, page 165. Such a notion is suggested in my Ingersoll Lecture on Human Immortality, Boston and London. 1899. Tertium Quid, 1887, p. 99, see also. Pages 148, 149.